Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the choking fog of Victorian London, where the air tastes of coal smoke. The cobblestones are slick with something you definitely don't want on your shoes, and every corner hides more mystery than comfort. Picture this. You're walking home after dark, gas lamps flickering weakly, shadows stretched long across streets that already feel too narrow. That faint hiss of burning gas is the only thing trying to keep the darkness at bay. And honestly, you probably won't survive this, but let's pretend you do, because otherwise, bedtime stories would be painfully short. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you are right now. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fun to see who else is listening in the quiet hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice, drifting through the streets of London in the mid-1800s, is the fog. It isn't the romantic, dreamy mist you see in period dramas. No, this is the infamous London particular, a thick soup of smoke, soot, and dampness, courtesy of thousands of coal fires pumping grime into the sky. People joked you could slice it with a knife, but no one was laughing when horse-drawn carriages disappeared into it and never made the turn. You, stepping carefully forward, feel it cling to your coat, sting your eyes, and sit heavy in your lungs. Every breath tastes faintly of ash, like licking the inside of a fireplace. Gaslight was supposed to make all of this more bearable. Introduced widely in the early 19th century, those lamps lined main thoroughfares and gave London a kind of ghostly glow. Imagine hundreds of little halos of yellow-orange flame bobbing through the haze, creating halos and shadows in equal measure. Romantic? Sure, if you're watching from a distance. But for the pedestrians, like you, it was a mixed blessing. The glow was never strong enough to reveal what might be lurking a few steps away. Too dim to comfort, but just enough to remind you there was more out there than darkness. Historians still argue whether gaslight truly made the streets safer or simply cast deeper shadows where crime could fester. And crime loved shadows. On nights like these, even sound was muffled, giving footsteps the eerie weight of someone or something just behind you. The city was alive with murmurs, with figures slipping between alleys and doorways, with the sharp echo of a horse's hooves on cobblestone disappearing into the fog. Londoners swore they could hear the city breathing like a beast rolling in its sleep. And honestly, when the air itself seems thick enough to swallow you, who could blame them? But don't worry, let's ground ourselves in something a little less spooky. A quirky tidbit. Not everyone hated the fog. Some artists and poets adored it. Painters like James McNeill Whistler saw inspiration in the smudged outlines and muted tones, capturing London's haze in dreamy canvases that critics sometimes dismissed as unfinished. You can almost laugh at the thought. Where one man saw beauty in the blurred shapes, another couldn't even find his front door without walking face first into a lamppost. You pause by the Thames, and here the fog becomes almost unbearable. The river already smelled bad, thanks to sewage dumping, but on foggy nights it took on the density of soup, thickened with industrial waste and the breath of millions. There was the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when hot weather and untreated sewage turned the Thames into an unbearable cesspool, forcing Parliament to literally flee the building. It sounds almost like slapstick comedy, until you remember thousands died from cholera outbreaks tied directly to that water. But on nights like this, you don't need to drink the Thames to feel it in your throat. Just standing near it, you can taste decay. And yet, Londoners carried on. Street vendors still shouted through the haze, hawking roasted chestnuts and hot eels. Couples still strolled arm in arm, their parasols and top hats bobbing faintly in the half-light. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, their outlines melting into grayness, until only the rattle remained. Imagine living in a place where danger, beauty, survival, and filth mingled so seamlessly that people simply shrugged and said, "Well, that's London." There's another oddity worth pausing on: fog goggles. Yes, really, inventors tried to combat the city's murky atmosphere with glass eye protectors coated in chemicals meant to repel soot. They looked ridiculous, but in theory, they helped carriage drivers and pedestrians see a little more clearly. Spoiler alert, they didn't exactly catch on. People preferred squinting through soot over strapping weird contraptions to their faces, which, frankly, is very on brand for humans. What's fascinating is how the fog shaped London's reputation worldwide. Travelers described it as both terrifying and enchanting. American visitors in particular were stunned, noting how London seemed perpetually veiled, as though hiding secrets on purpose. And secrets, of course, there were plenty. This was a city in flux, the largest in the world, capital of a sprawling empire, yet teetering between dazzling modernity and medieval darkness. As the lamps flicker, you can sense the contradictions in every brick and shadow. Walking further, your ears prick to a sound, the steady hiss of gas escaping from a lamp. Leaks were common, and people joked about exploding lampposts. But the danger wasn't funny when entire streets could be cloaked not only in fog, but in an invisible cloud of gas, ready to ignite from the flick of a match. Fire brigades were constantly on edge. One careless spark, and London's choking fog could turn into a fireball. You pause, let that sink in. The very thing meant to illuminate the streets also threatened to blow them up. A neat metaphor, perhaps, for Victorian London itself. Progress and peril bound together, shining just brightly enough to keep you from despair, while always reminding you that one wrong step could be your last. As you press forward, a carriage emerges from the mist so suddenly you nearly step into its path. The driver curses, his words muffled but sharp, and the horse's eyes gleam white in the lamplight. For a moment, it feels like the city itself is testing you. Will you slip beneath its wheels, another nameless casualty swallowed by London streets? You step back just in time, heart pounding, and the carriage rattles away, swallowed again by shadow. And so, you keep moving, guided by weak gaslight and the occasional shout of another wanderer. You realize that here, in this city of fog and fire, survival isn't just about breathing, it's about listening, sensing, and trusting that every step forward won't lead you straight into something you'd rather not find. The mystery of Victorian London has already wrapped itself around you, and the night has only just begun. The gaslight fades behind you, and now the fog thickens as you press deeper into the city's back alleys. These narrow lanes are less forgiving, more sinister, like the veins of London that carry its secrets. You duck beneath laundry strung across crumbling brick walls, shirts and petticoats dripping in the damp air. The smell hits you first, rot, refuse, and human life packed too tightly. It isn't the kind of odor you can wave away. It clings, the way smoke clings to a wool coat after a night near the fire. Your boots scrape against cobbles, slick with things better left uninvestigated. The alleys run like a labyrinth, twisting between warehouses, tenements, and forgotten corners where light barely intrudes. These are the spaces the grand avenues avoid, the arteries where poverty breathes. Here, entire families cram into single rooms of decaying houses, walls sweating moisture, floors crawling with vermin. Rats scuttle openly bold as cats, darting into rubbish heaps where children dig for scraps. Imagine being small enough that the alley itself seems taller than you, towering, with every shadow a potential threat. Children raised in these places knew hunger before they knew toys, and mud before they knew shoes. Historians still argue whether poverty in Victorian London was truly unavoidable, or whether mismanagement and greed hardened a city already leaning on the backs of its poor. You pass a group of costermongers, the street vendors who sell everything from fish to flowers. They shout to attract attention, their voices cutting through the fog. A man slices an apple with a knife, offering wedges to children who look on hungrily. Behind him, a woman ladles broth from a pot, the steam briefly overpowering the stench of the alley. It's survival at its rawest. If you don't sell, you don't eat. And yet, somehow, there's resilience here. People carve out lives in spaces that look unlivable. A mother hums to her infant at the doorway of a crumbling tenement, her song oddly sweet against the backdrop of decay. A boy, no older than 7, darts between legs with pockets already bulging, pickpocket in training. You almost want to applaud his skill, except you also clutch your coat instinctively tighter. Now, let's pause for one of those odd Victorian quirks. Night soil men. Yes, you heard that right. Before sewage systems were properly installed, someone had to clear out cesspits and privies. Imagine trudging through these same alleys in the dead of night with a bucket, scooping human waste to cart away for disposal. It was miserable work, but oddly essential. Without them, the city would have drowned in its own filth even faster than it already did. You can joke that these workers were the unsung sanitation superheroes of their day, though I doubt they wore capes. The alleys weren't just homes for the poor, they were also the stage for darker trades. You glimpsed the corner of a gin palace glowing faintly through the mist, its doorway crowded with bodies desperate for cheap escape. Gin was nicknamed Mother's Ruin, for good reason. A penny might buy you enough to forget the hunger, the cold, or the bruises for a few hours. Step inside and you'd find men slumped over tables, women singing bawdy tunes, children darting between with trays of drinks. It was messy, loud, and alive. But outside, the silence of the alley feels heavier, as though the city itself wants to smother you in quiet. Scholars debate whether these hidden corners were truly lawless, or whether they functioned under their own rough code. There's evidence that neighbors looked out for one another, warning of police patrols or sharing food in dire times. And yet, the alleys were also fertile ground for gangs, prostitution, and violence. Police tread carefully here, and often reluctantly, for the fog and maze-like streets favor the hunted over the hunter. As you move forward, you stumble on another peculiar detail of life here: cat meat. Yes, you heard me. When poverty bit hardest, unscrupulous butchers sold cat, dog, and even donkey disguised as rabbit or beef. People bought it, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. It's a reminder that hunger doesn't argue with pride. You might laugh grimly at the idea of Victorian Londoners dining on mystery meat, but for them, it was survival. You squeeze between two leaning houses, wood beams bowed like they're exhaling under centuries of weight. The lane opens to a tiny courtyard, barely wide enough for 3 people to stand shoulder to shoulder. A rag and bone man picks through refuse, scavenging old shoes, metal scraps, or broken furniture to resell. This recycling trade was the city's unofficial lifeline. Nothing went to waste. Not really. An old boot became patch material, bones became buttons or glue, even ash from hearth fires found new life as cleaning powder. The city consumed itself again and again to keep moving forward. Listen closely, and you hear coughs echoing down the walls, sharp and wet. Tuberculosis thrived in these damp quarters, taking lives in slow, painful gasps. The alleys were both cradle and coffin. And yet, the residents endured. They painted doors in bright colors, strung flowers from windowsills, and raised voices in laughter when payday or payday gin allowed. Even in misery, humanity fought for a scrap of dignity. It's strange, isn't it? In the elegant boulevards, London shone with polished stone and horse-drawn carriages. But just a turn away, these cramped veins of the city reminded you what really kept London alive. People who never made it into the history books, but whose sweat and survival powered the empire. Without the alleys, the palaces and parlors wouldn't exist. As you step back into the main lane, the fog seems thicker than before. You realize the alleys aren't just physical spaces, they're metaphors too. The parts of society no one wanted to acknowledge, hidden just enough to be forgotten by those who benefited most. But you've seen them now. You've smelled the rot, heard the coughs, and glimpsed the lives lived in shadows. And once you've seen the back alleys of Victorian London, you can never unsee them. The alleys spit you back out onto a busier street, though busier in Victorian London doesn't always mean better. The fog swirls here too, but it carries the sharper smell of fried fish, horse dung, and freshly cut onions from the carts of costermongers lined along the curb. If the back alleys were survival in shadows, this is survival in plain sight, the shadow economy that stitched together the city's daily rhythm. You pause by a costermonger's cart stacked high with apples and pears. His cries echo over the clatter of hooves. Fine fruit, half a penny, fresh as morning dew. Never mind that the fruit has probably rolled around on the floor of a warehouse or sat in foggy air for days. The trick is to shout louder than the competition, to smile even when your pockets are empty, and to make a sale before the food spoils. London's poor depended on these vendors. Grocery stores weren't a luxury most could afford. Next, a rat catcher ambles by with cages clinking on his back, live rats scratching inside. His dogs trail behind him, lean and eager. You stare, half horrified, half impressed. These men weren't exterminators in the modern sense. They caught rats alive to sell for sport. Rat baiting, where terriers were thrown into pits swarming with rodents, was a grim but wildly popular entertainment. It sounds cruel now, and let's be honest, it was, but it gave working people an outlet for excitement, betting, and escape from their daily grind. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Queen Victoria herself was rumored to keep a pet rat. Though historians still argue whether that was fact or just gossip, spread by amused critics of the crown. Street performers crowd the corners, too. An organ grinder cranks out a tune, his monkey in a waistcoat dancing clumsily to the rhythm. Children squeal and toss coppers, while pickpockets squeal silently inside their heads, because distracted crowds were their playground. You can almost admire the ingenuity. It was an ecosystem of chaos where everyone played a part. If you didn't sell, sing, or steal, you didn't eat. The shadow economy extended deeper than street vendors. Night comes, and lodging houses open their doors. For a penny, you might get a spot on the floor, shoulder to shoulder with dozens of others. For a little more, you could sleep rough on a rope stretched across the room, leaning forward like a tied-up scarecrow until morning. Yes, the infamous penny sit-up really existed. Imagine paying money to nap while dangling from a rope, your chin pressed into your chest, praying you don't topple onto the stranger snoring beneath you. Historians still debate whether these were acts of necessity or acts of exploitation, but either way, they were real, and they kept the city's poorest barely alive. Further down the lane, you notice another figure, an old woman hawking matches. Street children, some no older than 6, trudge behind her with trays of candles, shoe polish, or pins. They called them the little traders, but the term feels almost mocking. These kids weren't learning business, they were scraping survival. Charles Dickens, with his sharp eye for injustice, immortalized them in his novels. But for you, walking here, they're flesh and bone, coughing in the fog, begging with wide eyes that no child should ever carry. And then there were the pure finders, men and women who scraped dog droppings from the streets and sold it to tanneries for leather processing. That's right, even poop had a price. The city functioned on such trades, all hidden in plain sight, woven into daily life like the rhythm of a heartbeat. One person's waste, literally, was another's bread money. Amid this chaos, police officers, newly minted as bobbies after Sir Robert Peel, patrolled with batons and whistles. They were symbols of order, though not always welcomed. Street vendors saw them as a nuisance, thieves saw them as obstacles, and the poor often saw them as enforcers of laws tilted against survival. Did the bobbies keep the city safer? Historians still argue. Some say their presence reduced violent crime. Others claim they simply pushed it further into the shadows where it grew harder to track. What's striking is the duality of it all. By daylight, these streets looked like marketplaces buzzing with life, smells, and chatter. By night, the same spaces turned dangerous, echoing with whispers of deals too risky for daylight. Stolen goods changing hands, prostitutes waiting in shadowed doorways, drunks stumbling toward gin shops. You, walking here, can feel the shift as the lamps flicker on. The economy doesn't stop. It simply changes costume. Let's lighten the mood with another oddity. Sometimes rat catchers got so good at their jobs they trained their rats to do tricks. Yes, picture this. Tiny rodents balancing on sticks, rolling balls, or scampering through hoops. Audiences actually paid to watch. And for once, the rats weren't the villains of the story. They were little circus performers in their own right, outshining the dogfights and brawls. Still, beneath the oddities and humor, the truth hums like the organ grinder's tune. This economy existed because people had no choice. The respectable jobs of factories, docks, or house service couldn't absorb everyone. The rest made do with whatever hustle kept hunger at bay. It wasn't pretty, but it was resourceful. It wasn't dignified, but it was relentless, and it kept London alive. As you step past the final row of carts, a ragged boy tugs at your sleeve, trying to sell you a tin of boot polish. His hands are blackened, his cheeks hollow, his eyes strangely bright in the lamplight. You shake your head gently, but his voice lingers. "Please, sir, only a penny?" You walk on, heart heavier, realizing the truth. This shadow economy is not a sideshow. It is London. You slip away from the bustle of the street market and drift deeper into the shadows where figures lean against doorways waiting. Their voices are low, sometimes coaxing, sometimes sharp. This is the unseen workforce, the women of the night, whose presence defined much of Victorian London's darker reputation. Gas lamps flicker across their faces, and for a moment you see them as the city itself. Tired, painted, alluring, but burdened. Prostitution wasn't new, but in the Victorian era it became both more visible and more scandalous. Poverty pushed thousands of women into the trade. Widows, abandoned wives, young girls with nowhere else to turn. Estimates suggest there were over 80,000 prostitutes working in London by the mid-19th century. That's almost the population of a small city hidden in the shadows of a larger one. You tread carefully past them, sensing eyes following your steps, not always with malice, sometimes just with the quiet hope of a transaction. The irony: Victorian morality preached purity and restraint while simultaneously fueling this demand. Men of respectable standing often visited brothels at night and then denounced the very same women in daylight. Historians still argue whether Victorian society was truly prudish or whether the prudishness was a mask that made hypocrisy more acceptable. Either way, women bore the cost. Brothels ranged from dingy back rooms to opulent establishments with velvet curtains, wine, and music. Some catered to wealthy clients, others to dock workers who pooled coins just for a few minutes. The brothel madams, often former prostitutes themselves, ran tight ships, offering protection but also extracting heavy fees. Meanwhile, streetwalkers faced the most danger, exposed to violence, disease, and police raids. And yes, the police were part of the problem. Arrests were common, but so were bribes. The line between law enforcement and exploitation blurred until it was just another shade of fog. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Fallen women weren't always seen as beyond redemption. Charitable institutions sprang up to rescue them, offering sewing lessons or laundry work. The Magdalene asylums, for example, claimed to reform prostitutes into respectable women through prayer and labor. Noble in intent, maybe, but the reality was often more about control than compassion. Imagine being forced to scrub floors 12 hours a day, while being told your soul needed constant saving. It's enough to make you prefer the alley. You turn a corner and hear laughter. Sharp, slightly desperate, but laughter nonetheless. A group of women share a flask, teasing each other as they call out to passers-by. Their camaraderie feels like armor against the dangers of the night. You sense they know the risks all too well. Venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant, spreading faster than doctors could treat them. Treatments, by the way, often involved mercury. So yes, in an attempt to cure illness, many patients slowly poisoned themselves. London was a city where survival often came at a heavy price, whether in poverty or in medicine. Jack the Ripper's name whispers here, though his shadow will loom larger later in your walk. For now, his legend hasn't yet consumed the streets, but fear simmers underneath. Women disappear, and whispers say they're taken by something worse than poverty, something hunting them. You keep walking, half wondering if footsteps behind you are real or only your imagination stirred by stories. The city itself tried to manage prostitution with laws like the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to arrest suspected prostitutes and force them into medical examinations. The outrage was massive, not just because of the intrusion, but because men, the other half of the equation, were never subjected to the same scrutiny. Double standards. Thy name is Victorian London. Campaigners like Josephine Butler fought fiercely to repeal these acts, arguing they punished women while excusing men. Eventually, the laws were overturned, but the damage lingered in every story, every scar. And yet, despite the hardships, there were moments of defiance. Some women formed informal networks, sharing tips about dangerous clients, warning each other about police traps, or even pooling money for sick friends. They carved out dignity in spaces designed to strip it away. It's easy to paint them as victims, but survival here took grit, wit, and resilience. You can almost hear them laughing at the thought of being pitied. They were too busy living. Let's step into a brothel for just a second. Not literally, don't worry. This is still a PG-13 bedtime story. Imagine dim rooms filled with the scent of cheap perfume, candles flickering against wallpaper stained with smoke. Musicians play softly in the corner, men whisper, women smile. For some, this was not only a place of business, but of community. In a society that shunned them, here they found a sense of belonging, however fragile. And yes, not every client was after sex. Some came for company, to talk, to drink without judgment. It's a reminder that loneliness was just as rampant in Victorian London as poverty. The city may have been crowded, but it was also isolating. In the end, people craved connection, even if they had to pay for it. The fog presses closer now, muffling voices as you leave the women behind. Their figures dissolve into the shadows, as if they were never there, and yet you know their presence is etched into every corner of this city, whether history acknowledges them or not. Without them, the streets would lose half their story. The gaslight flickers once more, and you wonder how many lives were lived in the margins, unseen, unspoken, yet shaping the very fabric of London. You drift away from the night streets and find yourself before a hulking brick building, its windows barred and its doorway flanked by an iron gate. A chill runs through you even before stepping closer. This is the workhouse, the institution designed to help the poor, though anyone who passed through its doors knew the truth. It was a place of despair. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 created these houses across England with the lofty intention of giving aid to those who couldn't support themselves. Sounds noble, right? In reality, the system was built on the principle of less eligibility, meaning the conditions inside had to be worse than the lowest paid job outside. The message was clear. Enter here only if you have no other choice. You shuffle inside, and immediately the air feels colder, like the building itself resents you. Families arriving at the gates were separated, husbands from wives, parents from children. Imagine being a child clinging desperately to your mother's hand, only to be pried away by officials, never knowing if you'd see her again. Historians still argue whether this separation was an intentional cruelty meant to deter people, or just bureaucratic logic gone heartless. Either way, it scarred generations. The daily routine was rigid. Wake before dawn, eat a breakfast of watery gruel, and march off to labor. Men often broke stones for road construction or ground bones for fertilizer. Women scrubbed floors, sewed coarse uniforms, or picked oakum. Tarred rope fibers pulled apart until their fingers bled. Children worked too, sometimes in silence so strict that if they spoke, punishment followed swiftly. You hear the rasp of rope between small hands, the coughs echoing through cold halls, the heavy clang of a work bell dictating every move. Here's your quirky tidbit. Oakum picking became such a notorious symbol of punishment that even prisoners in places like Newgate were set to the same task. The Victorians seemed obsessed with the idea that misery built character, as if blistered fingers and endless tedium could somehow scrub the laziness from the poor. Spoiler, it didn't. Meals were barely sustenance. Bread so coarse it scraped your throat. Thin porridge that offered more water than oats. Sometimes a scrap of meat that was more gristle than nourishment. The goal wasn't to feed, it was to keep you just alive enough to keep working. And yet, there were reports of inmates sneaking food out or trading scraps under the tables, tiny acts of rebellion in a system designed to crush the spirit. The workhouses also doubled as infirmaries, though the care was hardly comforting. Overcrowded, underfunded, and staffed with little training, they often became places where illness spread instead of healed. Cholera outbreaks ripped through wards. Consumption claimed countless lives, and the phrase pauper's grave became a grim reality. Once you entered here sick, your chances of walking back out were slim. Outside, public opinion about workhouses was mixed. Some middle-class Victorians praised them as a necessary deterrent, convinced they reduced idleness. Others recoiled at the horror stories. Children starved, old men worked to death, mothers collapsing at their looms. Charles Dickens, always ready to expose hypocrisy, immortalized the cruelty in Oliver Twist with that infamous plea for more. You probably remember the scene. Tiny Oliver, bowl in hand, daring to ask for another scoop of gruel, only to be punished. It wasn't just fiction, it was a mirror. There's debate among scholars about whether every workhouse was as terrible as the worst accounts suggest. Some argue that conditions varied, with certain parishes providing decent care, especially later in the century. Others maintain the system was fundamentally cruel by design, ensuring that poverty was met with punishment rather than compassion. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but the image that stuck, cold, harsh, unforgiving, was powerful enough to stain the institution forever. You wander into the women's ward. Rows of gray uniforms line the walls, the sound of needle against cloth filling the room in a monotonous rhythm. A matron stalks between rows, her shoes clicking sharply, eyes searching for mistakes. The women don't look up, though you sense the weight of their thoughts. Children taken away, husbands lost, freedom a distant memory. Yet, in the corner, a woman hums quietly while stitching. It's a soft defiance, a thread of humanity that even the workhouse can't unravel. Let's lighten the mood with a strange little fact. Some inmates found ways to play the system. Workhouse tourists, as they were nicknamed, moved from one institution to another. staying just long enough to get food and shelter before moving on. Officials grumbled about the scandalous freeloading, but you can't help but smirk. If survival meant gaming a cruel system, well, that took more wit than most officials gave them credit for. The truth is, workhouses became symbols of fear. For the poor hovering just above desperation, the threat of ending up inside was enough to keep them clinging to odd jobs, street selling, or even crime. The walls of these buildings loomed like warnings. Behave, work, endure, or this will be your fate. You leave the workhouse with the clang of the gate echoing in your ears, the sound of finality. Behind those walls, countless lives were shaped, bent, or broken. And as you step back into the foggy street, you realize London's true cruelty wasn't in the alleys or the shadows. It was in institutions built to help, but that often hurt the most. The city didn't just hide misery, it codified it in brick and law. You keep walking, the clang of that workhouse gate still ringing in your ears, but soon the streets open up into a different kind of nightmare. Here, children shuffle past in oversized boots, their faces smeared with soot, their backs bent as if the weight of London itself rests on their shoulders. This is child labor in Victorian London, not the sentimental helping father in the shop kind of work, but the brutal, bone-grinding reality that consumed thousands of small lives. Factories, mines, chimneys, anywhere an adult body was too large, a child's would be forced to fit. You catch sight of a boy, maybe 8 years old, black streaks on his cheeks, a rope tied around his waist. He's a climbing boy, trained to scramble up narrow chimneys with a brush, scraping soot until his lungs choke and his knees bleed. The job was so dangerous that many suffocated in the shafts. There are records of children getting stuck and dying slowly in the dark, their bodies wedged in brick. Historians still argue whether master sweeps truly believed in the necessity of this work or simply ignored the horror because it was cheap and convenient. The children who survived carried lifelong scars, crooked backs, deformed joints, and what was grimly known as chimney sweep's cancer, caused by constant exposure to soot. And yet, these kids were seen scurrying across rooftops at dawn, their voices bright for a moment as they whistled down chimneys to prove they hadn't suffocated. You almost admire their grit, until you remember it wasn't a choice. In the textile mills, young girls worked long hours among rattling looms, their fingers nimble enough to fix threads while machines thundered around them. One slip, one moment of fatigue, and fingers or even limbs were caught. Accidents were so common they barely made the newspapers. Children as young as 5 worked in these mills, sometimes from 4 in the morning until 9 at night. You feel exhausted just imagining it. Your modern-day complaint about long office hours suddenly feeling embarrassingly small. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some kids found ways to make the work a little less miserable. In factories where machines were deafening, children learned to lip read so they could whisper jokes to one another without shouting. Imagine a row of soot-streaked faces, lips moving silently in conspiratorial giggles while the machines roared around them. For a brief moment, humor became rebellion. The coal mines swallowed children too. Trappers, they were called. Boys and girls who sat alone in darkness for 12-hour shifts, opening and closing ventilation doors as carts rumbled past. Their only light was a candle stub, their only company, the rats. Many never saw daylight except on Sundays, their skin pale as parchment. And yet, wages were wages, and families depended on them. The debate rages even now. Was it poverty that forced children underground, or the greed of mine owners who knew little hands were cheaper? London's streets also had their share of young workers, shoeblacks kneeling in the muck, match girls selling tiny bundles for pennies. The match girls in particular made history in 1888, when they struck against dangerous working conditions. Phosphorus used in the matches caused phossy jaw, a gruesome disease that literally rotted their bones. Their strike, led by girls barely in their teens, actually succeeded in raising awareness and forcing reforms. You can almost smile at the thought of these young women standing defiantly before factory gates, refusing to bow, sparking not just matches, but change. School was technically an option, especially after the Education Act of 1870, which laid the groundwork for compulsory education. But many families couldn't afford to lose the income, so children continued to labor, even while reformers preached about literacy. By the end of the century, the sight of ragged children in chimneys or mines had diminished somewhat, but not because society suddenly grew a heart, because machines eventually made them less useful. Imagine yourself walking past a row of lodging houses at night. Children collapse on straw mats, their bodies still twitching with the motions of the day, scrubbing, hauling, sewing. You want to tell them stories, to give them warmth, but they are already claimed by exhaustion. Their dreams, if they have any, are probably of bread or a day without coughing soot. Here's another odd quirk. Some Victorians believed work actually saved children from vice. Better to labor in a factory than to wander the streets as thieves or beggars, they argued. The irony is almost unbearable, saving children by slowly breaking their bodies. Historians still debate whether reformers genuinely thought labor was a moral safeguard or whether it was simply easier than tackling poverty itself. You pass by a group of boys splashing in a puddle, their laughter ringing strangely bright in the fog. One throws a lump of coal, another tackles him, and for a fleeting instant, they are just children again, not workers, not statistics. It's a reminder that even in the darkest labor, joy found cracks to seep through. But the truth is undeniable. Victorian London thrived on the small, aching shoulders of its children. The grand buildings, the bustling streets, the empire itself, much of it was built, quite literally, by hands that should have been holding toys. As you turn away, you feel the weight of all those unseen little voices pressing against the fog. The fog doesn't clear. It thickens, wrapping itself tighter as you push into a noisier part of the city. Here, the air hums with clanging metal, the hiss of steam, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers on anvils. Welcome to the industrial heart of Victorian London, where factories sprout like steel and brick mushrooms, and the skyline bristles with smokestacks belching black clouds. You cough before you even realize it, your lungs prickling with soot that feels like sandpaper going down. This is progress, London style, loud, dirty, and impossible to ignore. It's hard to imagine now, but in the mid-19th century, London was the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution. Factories churning out textiles, shipyards hammering together iron leviathans, railways stretching fingers across the map. It was all happening at once. The city buzzed with ambition and mechanical invention. You might feel a little awe creeping in. as if you've stumbled onto the set of some giant clockwork play, gears turning in perfect, if deafening, unison. But look closer. That shiny machine age has a dark underbelly. The workers here, men and women alike, toil 12 to 16 hours a day in conditions that would make your office cubicle feel like a spa. Steam presses, printing machines, and steel rollers roar around you, each one a potential guillotine for anyone unlucky enough to slip. Factories didn't exactly prioritize safety. Why would they, when labor was cheap and easily replaceable? Historians still argue whether Victorian industrialists genuinely saw themselves as progress pioneers or simply ignored the human wreckage because profits came first. One quirky detail: workers sometimes stuffed cotton or wool in their ears to dull the factory noise. Earplugs weren't really a thing yet, so people improvised. Imagine walking into this deafening space and seeing rows of workers with fluffy white tufts sticking out of their ears. It might look like some strange fashion statement until you remember it was survival. You brush past a group of women bent over sewing machines, their hands moving in a blur, stitching shirts for soldiers bound for distant colonies. Women in these factories often earned half the wages of men, yet they endured the same choking dust and the same long hours. When they finally staggered home, many still faced domestic chores and child care waiting for them. That Victorian angel of the house ideal. More like an exhausted angel running on tea and sheer willpower. Factories didn't just reshape work, they reshaped the city itself. London's population exploded as rural families poured in, chasing wages. Rows of hastily built tenements sprang up near industrial districts, packed with families crammed into single rooms. Sanitation lagged far behind, so sewage often flowed right past factory gates, mixing with soot until the very ground squelched under your boots. That smell you're catching? It's part burning coal, part rotting refuse, part ambition on fire. Railways deserve their own spotlight. You might hear the thunder of trains from here, wheels screeching against iron tracks. The first underground line in the world, the Metropolitan Railway, opened in 1863. People called it the Metropolitan Railway of Death at first because the carriages were filled with choking smoke from steam engines. Riding it was like stepping into a rolling chimney. But hey, at least it got you across town faster. Historians still debate whether Londoners actually embraced the underground or simply tolerated it until cleaner electric trains came along decades later. Even the famous Thames didn't escape industry. Ships unloaded coal, iron, and cotton along its banks, while warehouses stacked goods higher than rooftops. Barges carried everything from timber to whale oil upriver, while waste from factories poured right back in. You're not imagining that oily sheen on the water. Sometimes it shimmered with rainbow streaks of grease. Almost pretty, if you forgot it was poisoning everything alive beneath. Workers' protests occasionally broke the industrial monotony. Trade unions began to form, voices demanding shorter hours and safer conditions. You picture a line of weary men outside a foundry, fists clenched not for violence, but for fairness. Strikes weren't always successful, but they planted seeds for later reforms. Here's your quirky tidbit. One strike was sparked when workers complained about being forced to drink water contaminated with lead pipes. Their employers scoffed, insisting lead wasn't that bad. Historians still argue whether Victorian science was genuinely clueless about lead poisoning or whether industrialists pretended not to know. The contrast between rich and poor became even sharper here. Wealthy factory owners lived in grand townhouses enjoying the very luxuries their workers produced. You might imagine one industrialist leaning back in a velvet chair, sipping tea while reading the Times, utterly insulated from the soot-blackened faces filing out of his plant. The hypocrisy feels almost cartoonish, but it was real. You take another step, and your boots squish into a puddle of oily water reflecting the glow of gas lamps overhead. The lamps themselves are products of this industrial boom, fueled by gas extracted from coal. They cast a ghostly yellow light, making the smoke look like restless phantoms curling above rooftops. Factories gave London wealth, yes, but also endless contradictions. The machines roared with progress, but their song was punctuated by coughs, strikes, and funerals. Some historians argue this was the price of modernization, while others insist it didn't have to be so cruel. Either way, you can feel the truth vibrating under your feet. London in this era was an engine, and engines always burn something to keep running. You pause, ears ringing from the clang of machinery, lungs heavy with smoke. Maybe you wonder if you'd been born here, would you be one of the soot-faced workers trudging home in darkness? Or would you be one of the lucky few, pockets lined with coins, praising progress from a cushioned chair? Either way, the factory smoke follows you as you move on, clinging to your clothes, a reminder that industrial progress was never clean. It was built on sweat, soot, and sacrifice. The smoke clings to your hair as you wander deeper into the labyrinth of London, and suddenly the city shifts again. The clang of factories fades, replaced by the scratch of quills on paper, the rustle of pamphlets, and the chatter of newsboys crying headlines into the fog. This is the age of ideas, when reformers and radicals fill the air with fiery words, pamphlets flutter like pigeons, and debates spill from taverns into the streets. You've stepped into Victorian London's reformist undercurrent, and it's as restless as the Thames in a storm. Picture yourself ducking into a dimly lit coffee house. The air is thick with tobacco smoke, and every table bristles with arguments. Some men rail about workers' rights, others dream of universal education, and a few whisper dangerously about women voting one day. You sip bitter coffee that tastes like overboiled ink and wonder if this is where revolutions begin. Not with gunfire, but with sentences scribbled on cheap paper. One fact that steadies you: the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 gradually expanded the vote. Each act cracked the door a little wider, though the poorest men and all women were still left knocking outside. It wasn't democracy as you know it, but for the Victorians, it felt like a storm breaking through the old stone walls of aristocracy. Historians still argue whether these reforms were driven by genuine progress or by elites terrified of uprisings spreading from France. Pamphlets were the lifeblood of reform. Imagine stacks of handbills printed overnight, ink still tacky, promising justice for child laborers or demanding clean water for cholera-ridden neighborhoods. They'd be shoved into your hand at a street corner before you could say no. One quirky detail: some pamphleteers used elaborate pseudonyms like a friend of the poor or the watchman at midnight, which makes them sound like superheroes moonlighting as writers. In truth, they were often school teachers, printers, or factory workers with just enough coins for ink and paper. The suffrage movement was stirring too, though still decades away from full bloom. Women gathered in small circles, often mocked as hysterical or unnatural, to demand a say in government. Picture a young woman nervously addressing a crowded hall, while half the audience laughs and jeers. Still, she keeps speaking, voice trembling but firm, because silence feels worse. Historians still debate whether early suffragists truly believed victory would come in their lifetime, or if they were simply planting seeds for future generations. Meanwhile, other reformers fought battles over education. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 began to chip away at illiteracy by establishing the first widespread system of schooling. Children who once scrubbed chimneys or sold matches on street corners now carried slate boards and chalk instead. Still, school days were short and discipline brutal. You wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of a schoolmaster's cane. But progress was progress, even if it left bruises. Trade unions were growing louder, too. Imagine a hall packed with workers, their calloused hands rising in unison as they vote for a strike. The air trembles with chants, with frustration at endless hours and pitiful wages. You glance at the posters plastered on the walls, hand-drawn fists, clumsy but passionate slogans. One quirky tidbit: some union halls hosted brass bands to lift morale, so you might hear Rule Britannia played off-key between speeches demanding bread and fair pay. And don't forget the radicals who took things further. Chartists demanding universal male suffrage in the 1840s, anarchists who scribbled fiery manifestos about smashing all hierarchies. You feel a shiver down your spine as you pass a group muttering about revolution by candlelight. Will they change the world, or simply fade into footnotes? Historians still argue whether these radical movements truly shaped policy, or just scared the ruling classes into cautious reforms. The reformist energy didn't stop at politics. It bled into morality, too. Temperance societies popped up everywhere, wagging fingers at gin palaces and urging men to trade liquor for lemonade. Some reformers truly believed banning alcohol would cure poverty, crime, and domestic violence in one sweep. You imagine stern-faced Victorians signing pledges never to drink again, while outside, pubs overflowed with laughter and clinking glasses. That contradiction feels very London. Progress argued in one room, pleasure roaring in the next. In quieter corners, reformers whispered about the empire itself. Could Britain rule half the world and still call itself moral? Some voices condemned the cruelty of colonial practices, while others cheered imperial expansion as a noble duty. You overhear one heated debate in a bookshop. Two men almost coming to blows over whether India was being civilized or exploited. The truth, you sense, lay tangled somewhere between their shouts. Even prison reform had its champions. Remember those dark cells you passed earlier? Reformers like Elizabeth Fry campaigned to treat prisoners more humanely, insisting that rehabilitation mattered as much as punishment. Imagine her visiting filthy jails, reading scripture to women huddled on straw floors, trying to light candles in a place designed for shadows. Historians still argue whether such reforms truly improved prisons or just made them more efficient machines of control. As you leave the coffee house, pamphlet stuffed into your pockets, you catch sight of a crowd gathered around a fiery speaker standing on a crate. His voice cracks the night like a whip, railing against landlords, praising progress, cursing injustice. You can't help smiling at the energy. It's half inspiring, half exhausting. Reform in Victorian London was messy, contradictory, and often painfully slow. Yet without it, the city might never have dragged itself out of the muck. And so you walk on, ears still ringing with slogans, mind buzzing with the realization that words, as fragile as paper, could bend the iron bars of the age. The city exhales again, and this time the smoke gives way to velvet curtains, the golden glow of chandeliers, and the hush of an expectant crowd. You slip from reformist rallies and pamphlet-littered streets into the plush red seats of Victorian London's theaters, concert halls, and lecture rooms. Here, the working poor and the aristocracy alike sit elbow to elbow, at least in theory, because everyone hungers for a good story, a stirring song, or even a gruesome spectacle if it keeps the long nights bearable. Imagine the gaslights flickering, casting halos of light on painted backdrops. The stage feels alive, and the actors seem larger than life. Charles Dickens himself once performed dramatic readings of his novels in these halls, his voice pulling tears and laughter from audiences. You lean forward, realizing this was a city where storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was therapy for a society weighed down by soot and sorrow. Theaters weren't all genteel, though. Some catered to bawdy humor, cheap melodramas, or spectacular reenactments of naval battles complete with miniature ships and tanks of water. Yes, real tanks of water on stage. Audiences gasped as tiny cannons fired. One quirky tidbit: some theaters staged animal acts, where monkeys or dogs performed tricks between dramatic scenes, as though Hamlet wasn't enough excitement without a juggling poodle. Historians still argue whether this was clever crowd-pleasing or a shameless ploy to distract from mediocre scripts. Music halls were even rowdier. You step into one, and immediately the noise hits you like a pint glass to the ear. Songs belt from the stage, audiences shout back, and tankards of beer slosh across sticky tables. Singers belt out comic numbers about nagging wives or drunken uncles, while dancers whirl under flickering lamps. The atmosphere is closer to a football match than a concert. And yes, this is where some of the first pop culture celebrities were born. People whistled their favorite tunes in the streets the next day. Meanwhile, in lecture halls, Victorians fed a different hunger: curiosity. Science lectures drew huge crowds, sometimes rivaling theater performances. Picture a professor rolling out a mysterious machine, lighting up sparks, and shocking volunteers with mild electric currents. The audience gasps, children giggle, and someone in the back mutters about witchcraft. This was an age when science teetered between spectacle and seriousness. One famous lecturer, Michael Faraday, filled auditoriums with demonstrations of magnetism and electricity. He was basically the Marvel superhero of Victorian physics. At the same time, spiritualist shows surged in popularity. Mediums claimed to summon the dead in smoky parlors, producing mysterious knocks, floating trumpets, or ghostly whispers. You find yourself at one such seance, the table trembling beneath your fingertips. Is it spirits, or just a clever trick with wires? Historians still argue whether Victorians were gullible dupes or simply willing to suspend disbelief for a comforting illusion. Either way, the line between entertainment and belief blurred nightly across the city. Art galleries and exhibitions also played their part in shaping culture. The great exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace was the crown jewel, a sprawling display of technology, art, and curiosities under a vast glass roof. Imagine walking through aisles of glittering machines exotic goods from the empire, and paintings that tried to capture the progress of humankind. One quirky detail: visitors could buy tiny souvenir models of the Crystal Palace itself, like Victorian snow globes. You'd almost expect them to sell popcorn, too. And then there was literature, penny dreadfuls, cheap, serialized booklets, thrilled working-class readers with lurid tales of highwaymen, monsters, and murder. Picture yourself holding a flimsy paper booklet about Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, wondering if he might lurk around the next corner. For just a penny, you could escape into nightmares more exciting than your own poverty. Historians still argue whether penny dreadfuls corrupted youth or provided them with an affordable taste of storytelling. Even high art mingled with the sensational. Painters of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood shocked critics with their luminous, almost photographic detail and mythic subjects. Meanwhile, engravings in illustrated magazines brought images of the world into even the poorest homes. One quirky tidbit: some engravers secretly slipped their initials into clouds or tree bark, like Victorian Easter eggs for the observant reader. Not every performance needed a stage. Street performers, organ grinders, and Punch and Judy puppeteers drew crowds on corners and in markets. The shrill squeaks of Punch laughing maniacally carried through alleys. Children clapped, adults rolled their eyes, and you wonder if this was the Victorian equivalent of cat videos. Ubiquitous, slightly annoying, but impossible to resist. What ties all of this together is the way culture offered escape. For the poor, it was a break from endless work. For the middle class, it was a badge of refinement. For the elites, it was a chance to display taste, or at least pretend. Entertainment reflected London itself, a city of glittering facades and grimy alleyways, of intellectual sparks and cheap thrills. As you step out of the theater, the night feels different. Behind you, applause still echoes, mingled with drunken singing from the music hall. Ahead, the fog swallows you again, and you realize Victorian London's cultural world wasn't just about distraction. It was a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and desires of a restless society. You wander deeper into the heart of the city, and the cobblestones beneath your boots grow slick with a greasy sheen. The air feels heavier here, not because of smoke alone, but because of desperation itself. This is where the cracks in Victorian progress widen into chasms, and you see the human cost of the empire's dazzling wealth. Poverty and exploitation aren't whispered about in these streets. They're screamed, etched into every face, every doorway, every hungry child tugging at a stranger's sleeve. You pass a row of workhouses, their high walls looming like prisons. Inside, men and women are separated, families split apart, forced into monotonous labor in exchange for meager food and shelter. The workhouse system was meant as a safety net, but to many it felt more like punishment for being poor. Gruel for meals, hours of stone breaking or oakum picking, and a reputation that clung to you even if you managed to leave. Historians still argue whether workhouses were cruel deterrents or a grim but necessary attempt at welfare. Either way, you wouldn't last an hour here without your spirit being crushed. Children bear the brunt of the city's need for cheap labor. You peer down an alley and spot them. Tiny figures carrying coal baskets twice their size or darting between factory machines with fingers nimble enough to reach where adults cannot. Chimney sweeps climb into soot-choked flues, coughing and scraped raw, their small bodies the perfect fit for impossible spaces. One quirky but unsettling tidbit. Some master sweeps supposedly used to encourage reluctant children to climb by lighting a small fire beneath them. Victorian motivational tactics at their finest. Factories roar day and night, their windows glowing with infernal light. Inside, textile mills churn out fabric while workers collapse from exhaustion. 12-hour shifts are standard, sometimes longer. Safety standards practically non-existent. You can almost hear the clatter of machines, the endless thrum that must have sounded like a heartbeat of iron. And yet, people kept working because the alternative was hunger. The irony is sharp. The empire's global success rested on the bent backs of its most vulnerable citizens. The streets themselves are an endless labor market. Children hawk matches, women sell flowers, men carry heavy loads for pennies. You notice a group of mudlarks down by the Thames, ragged scavengers wading through sludge, searching for anything of value washed up in the muck. Buttons, nails, scraps of rope, all could mean supper for the night. One fringe detail. Sometimes mudlarks scavenged dead animals, even bloated dogs, to strip their hides or sell the bones. Nothing was too low if it meant survival. And then there were the sweated industries. In cramped garrets and basements, women stitched shirts and boots for endless hours, often by candlelight, paid a fraction of a man's wage. Their rooms reeked of damp fabric and wax. The term sweated wasn't just poetic, it described the literal sweat dripping from workers forced to produce goods under impossible deadlines. Some reformers called it white slavery, though the empire conveniently ignored its own complicity in broader forms of exploitation overseas. Children also became performers in their own grim way. You spot a ragged boy twisting somersaults in the street, a cap on the ground for coins. Another sings ballads with a voice cracked by hunger. Sometimes entire families performed in markets, hoping for enough copper to buy bread. Entertainment wasn't always glamorous. It could be survival itself. And poverty wasn't only about money. It was about morality, at least in the eyes of Victorian society. If you were poor, many assumed it was your fault, the result of laziness or drunkenness. The deserving poor, the widows, the sick, orphans, might get some sympathy, while the undeserving poor, able-bodied men out of work, prostitutes, beggars, were often treated with contempt. Historians still argue whether this strict moral divide helped reform efforts or simply perpetuated cruelty. Crime, naturally, walked hand in hand with poverty. Gangs of pickpockets worked the crowded markets, while thieves snatched handkerchiefs and watches with unnerving skill. You recall Dickens' artful dodger. Fiction, yes, but rooted in reality. One quirky tidbit. Thieves sometimes trained parrots to screech, "Stop thief," as a distraction, giving their human accomplices time to escape. Imagine explaining that to the police. And speaking of the police, their presence becomes more visible here, truncheons ready. But in truth, the law often targeted the poor more harshly than the rich. Petty theft could mean years of imprisonment or transportation overseas. Meanwhile, white-collar crimes in plush offices went largely unchecked. It's the same old story. Who you were mattered more than what you did. Amid all this bleakness, though, there are sparks of resilience. Neighbors share scraps of food. Women run informal daycare for each other's children, and street performers make passers-by laugh, if only for a moment. The poor carved out communities in the cracks, proving that survival in Victorian London wasn't just about enduring, it was about resisting despair with every small act of solidarity. You step away from the workhouse gates and back into the crowded streets. The smell of coal dust and sweat clinging to you. The city looms larger now, not as a marvel, but as a machine, feeding itself with human lives. The cultural glamour you saw earlier doesn't vanish, but it feels tainted, shadowed by the grinding poverty you can't unsee. You leave behind the sweatshops and alleyways, but the echoes of suffering follow you. Now your steps take you toward the Thames, that broad river slicing through the heart of London. It should be a source of life and trade, a ribbon of beauty gleaming in the moonlight. Instead, the stench hits you first. Sour, pungent, unmistakable. You wrinkle your nose, realizing that the river has become a sewer, a mirror reflecting the underbelly of the city. Victorian London's sanitation system was practically non-existent in its early decades. Human waste flowed through open gutters, joining the industrial runoff, and butchers' scraps dumped without hesitation into the Thames. Imagine walking past a bakery and smelling fresh bread, only to have the scent immediately drowned out by the overpowering reek of raw sewage. The contrast must have been maddening, and yet people lived with it every day, because where else could all that waste go? The river was both lifeline and latrine. The Great Stink of 1858 stands out as the most infamous moment in this story. That summer was unusually hot, and the combination of heat and filth turned the Thames into what was essentially a giant, bubbling cesspool. Lawmakers inside the Houses of Parliament, located conveniently right on the riverbank, gagged from the stench wafting through their windows. One quirky tidbit: some MPs supposedly soaked their handkerchiefs in vinegar and pressed them to their faces during debates. Historians still argue whether this episode directly pushed Parliament into funding Joseph Bazalgette's grand sewer system, but there's little doubt it made ignoring the problem impossible. Waterborne disease was rampant. Cholera swept through neighborhoods in terrifying waves, claiming thousands of lives. At first, many believed the illness spread through miasma, or bad air, which seemed logical when you smelled the Thames. But physician John Snow suspected otherwise. In one of history's most famous detective stories, he mapped cases of cholera in Soho to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. When authorities removed the pump handle, the outbreak dwindled. This moment marked a turning point for public health, though convincing the establishment took years. Even then, not everyone agreed. Historians still argue whether Snow's findings were embraced quickly or resisted by entrenched medical authorities clinging to their miasma theories. You peer into the dark river and imagine the daily life it supported or poisoned. Washerwomen beat laundry on the banks. Watermen ferried passengers back and forth. Barges carried coal, timber, and food. And alongside all this activity, rats scurried freely, spreading yet more disease. One fringe detail: some people claimed to see eels wriggling happily through the sewage, fattened by the endless flow of waste. Unsurprisingly, fried eels remained a working-class delicacy, proof that Londoners had stomachs as strong as their resilience. Sanitation extended beyond the river into the streets, where Night soil men collected human waste from cesspits and privies, hauling it away in carts. The job was so foul that workers often drank heavily just to endure it. If you think your day is bad, imagine clambering into a pit of decomposing filth by lantern light. One bizarre tidbit. Some of this waste was actually sold as fertilizer, creating a literal cycle of life and death between city and countryside. Public baths and wash houses emerged as attempts to improve hygiene, offering the poor places to bathe when home facilities were non-existent. Picture narrow stalls, steaming water, and the faint relief of being clean in a world constantly coated in grime. Yet even here, class played its part. Some establishments were better kept and safer than others, leaving many to continue bathing in the very river that poisoned them. The sewers eventually transformed London. Bazalgette's engineering marvel, built in the late 19th century, redirected waste away from the Thames, laying the foundation for the modern system still in use today. Imagine hundreds of miles of brick tunnels, vaulted like cathedrals, carrying filth out of the city. It's ironic. You might call them London's hidden cathedrals of cleanliness, unsung monuments that probably saved more lives than any palace or monument above ground. And yet, the struggle for cleanliness wasn't just about infrastructure, it was cultural, moral even. The Victorians believed cleanliness was next to godliness, and dirty bodies were often equated with dirty souls. Public health reformers argued for better sanitation, not just to prevent disease, but to uplift the moral character of the poor. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on morality helped reforms succeed or simply shamed the very people they were meant to help. As you watch a barge drift slowly under a bridge, its lantern reflecting in the oily water, you realize the Thames is more than just a river. It is a metaphor for Victorian London itself, vital, restless, overflowing with energy, yet polluted by exploitation and neglect. You shiver slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of that realization. The water laps at the banks, carrying with it both the empire's refuse and its future, depending on who's looking. You step away from the river, the stink still clinging to your clothes. Somewhere behind you, a rat squeaks, and the sound blends with the city's heartbeat. Sanitation might not be glamorous, but in this dark picture of Victorian life, it's as essential as oxygen. The stink of the Thames still lingers in your nose as you move deeper into the city, but soon another kind of odor takes over, an oily, metallic tang in the air, tinged with smoke. You look up and see chimneys stabbing at the sky, coughing out black plumes that hang low over the rooftops. This is the scent of industry, and it mixes with the clang of hammers, the rumble of carts, and the sharp hiss of steam engines. If the river showed you London's filth, the factories now show you its hunger for progress. By the mid-19th century, London had become the beating industrial heart of the empire. Textile mills, foundries, shipyards, and workshops turned raw materials from across the globe into finished goods. Cotton from India, rubber from Malaya, sugar from the Caribbean, all fed into the city's insatiable machine. You pass a warehouse stacked high with bales of cotton, while across the street a foundry glows red from molten iron. Sparks fly like fireflies, but the workers, shirtless, sweating, eyes rimmed with soot, don't even flinch. They're used to it. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes. Life inside a Victorian factory was relentless. 12 to 14-hour days were the norm, with few breaks and even fewer safety precautions. Imagine machinery as large as a modern truck spinning and whirring with belts, gears, and pistons, yet workers received no protective clothing. Fingers were lost, limbs crushed, lungs filled with dust. Children, nimble and small, were employed to crawl under machines to clear jams while the gears were still running. One quirky tidbit: some factories docked wages if workers stopped to drink water too often, as if thirst itself were laziness. Historians still argue whether factory owners genuinely believed such harshness built discipline, or whether it was just cruelty disguised as efficiency. Textile mills were particularly notorious. Cotton fibers filled the air, creating a constant haze that choked the lungs. Mill cough became a common phrase, though it was just one step away from tuberculosis. Meanwhile, ironworks and shipyards battered workers with deafening noise, sparks, and heat. London may not have been as famous as Manchester for textiles, but its docks and workshops made it a powerhouse of shipbuilding, engines, and armaments. You hear the echo of hammer on steel, the steady rhythm of industry like some grim percussion section playing London's theme song. And yet, for all the suffering inside, factories represented progress. They created jobs, however brutal, and filled the warehouses with goods that gave London its global dominance. The products of these sweat-drenched workshops weren't just shipped across the empire, they defined it. From iron rails for India's railways to uniforms for British soldiers, the city's factories stitched together the machinery of empire. The smog was the most visible legacy of this industrial growth. London's famous fog wasn't natural at all. It was smog, a toxic blend of coal smoke and mist. Picture thick, yellowish clouds hanging so heavy you can barely see the person in front of you. People coughed, stumbled, and sometimes even suffocated in it. One fringe detail: thieves supposedly used smog as cover for pickpocketing and burglary, vanishing into the haze before anyone could catch them. The government made halting attempts to regulate working conditions. The Factory Acts of the 19th century introduced limits on child labor and working hours, but enforcement was often patchy. Inspectors visited occasionally, but with so many factories and so few inspectors, many abuses continued unchecked. Historians still argue whether these laws represented genuine concern for workers or were more about placating public opinion. Either way, progress was slow, and thousands continued to toil in dangerous conditions for little pay. Unions began to emerge, though they faced resistance from employers and suspicion from authorities. Imagine groups of weary workers gathering in taverns, voices low, planning strikes or petitions by candlelight. Strikes were risky. Organizers could be arrested or blacklisted, but they were sometimes the only weapon workers had. One quirky tidbit: some strikes ended not with violence, but with employers bribing workers with beer to return to their jobs. It sounds comical now, but to men desperate for a pint and too little cash, it was temptation enough. For women, factory life was a double burden. Many worked long shifts in addition to managing households, raising children, and dealing with poverty. Some employers preferred hiring women because they could be paid less. In the matchstick factories, young girls known as match girls worked with white phosphorus, which caused a horrifying condition called phossy jaw. Their bones literally rotted from exposure. You can almost smell the sharp, acrid odor of phosphorus clinging to their skin, as they left the factory at night. The famous Match Girls strike of 1888 was one of the earliest successful labor movements led by women, forcing better conditions and bringing attention to their plight. Walking past these factories, you realize how industry shaped not just London's skyline, but also its soundscape. The constant thrum of machinery, the clang of iron, and the hiss of steam would have been inescapable. It was a lullaby of progress, but a brutal one. You joke to yourself that if you tried to sleep through it, you'd need earplugs the size of teacups. Still, not everything was bleak. Out of this industrial misery came innovation. Joseph Bazalgette's sewers, those cathedrals of cleanliness, were built with industrial brickwork. Advances in printing made books cheaper, spreading literacy. Steam power made travel faster, shrinking distances within the city. Historians still argue whether the benefits outweighed the human costs, but one truth stands. The industrial engine kept London alive, even as it ground down the people who fueled it. As you step away from the factories, the smoke curls around you like a shroud. Your throat is scratchy, your eyes sting, and you can't help but cough. Yet, oddly enough, you also feel the pulse of something unstoppable. Industry may have darkened the skies, but it also illuminated the world with invention. The question is whether the cost was too high. You leave behind the clang of machinery, but the noise doesn't fade. It changes. Now it's the rattle of carriage wheels, the shouts of drivers, the clop of horseshoes striking cobblestone slick with yesterday's rain. You're standing in the middle of Victorian London's traffic, and trust me, you're not crossing the street without risking your life. Forget jaywalking. Here, it's more like jousting with horses, wagons, and the occasional reckless omnibus barreling forward as if the driver had a grudge against pedestrians. Transport was the arteries of Victorian London, pumping people, goods, and gossip through the city. Horse-drawn omnibuses, essentially big carriages carrying up to 20 passengers, were the main mode of mass transit before trains and trams muscled in. You hop aboard one, perching on a narrow wooden bench. The ride is rough, the wheels bouncing over every cobblestone. You grab a rail as the omnibus lurches forward, trying not to slam into your neighbor. A fun tidbit. London's buses were often named after pubs or landmarks rather than numbers, so you might ask for the Elephant and Castle line instead of the number 12. Imagine a tourist today trying to decode that. Historians still argue whether London's transport system brought the city together or highlighted its divisions. For the wealthy, it was easy to ride in style. A private carriage, complete with polished horses and a driver in livery. For the working poor, transport was often too expensive, forcing them to trudge on foot through miles of dirty streets. Walking was the main commute, and your boots would quickly betray it, worn down from endless miles of pavement. By the 1860s, London's Underground, the world's first, was born. You descend into the tunnels of the Metropolitan Railway, the air damp and heavy with coal smoke from steam-powered trains. The carriages are lit with flickering gas lamps, and the heat is stifling. You're sweating before the train even moves. When it does, the smoke belches down the tunnel, filling the carriage with acrid fumes. You cough, eyes watering, wondering how anyone put up with this. Yet Londoners were fascinated, and newspapers called it the wonder of the age. Quirky tidbit: some passengers carried oranges to mask the smell of smoke, peeling them mid-ride just to breathe through the citrus. Horse-drawn trams arrived later, and by the end of the century, electric trams began humming along the streets. They were smoother, quieter, and faster than omnibuses. The streets began to change as tram lines carved permanent grooves into the city's fabric. You imagine the relief of a worker climbing aboard after a 12-hour shift in a factory, finally sitting down, finally carried instead of trudging. Still, transport had its dangers. Streets jammed with horses meant manure everywhere. An estimated 1,000 tons of it produced daily by the 1890s. Add in the constant risk of slipping in the mud, dodging runaway carts, or being trampled in crowded crossings. You probably wouldn't survive a week without a near miss. One fringe fact: some Victorians actually worried the city would be buried under manure as the population and horse use kept growing. Of course, the arrival of motor cars solved that problem while creating a new one: smog from exhaust. Progress giveth, progress taketh away. Coaches, hansom cabs, and private carriages all had their place in the hierarchy of movement. A hansom cab, a two-wheeled carriage with a driver perched high in the back, was the Victorian equivalent of a taxi. You hail one, and soon you're bouncing along at a brisk pace. The driver whips the reins, weaving through traffic with an agility that makes you grip the seat. It's a thrilling ride, though you silently pray the horse doesn't spook. River transport also played a role. Ferries, barges, and steamboats plied the Thames, carrying goods and passengers alike. You board a small steamboat, the deck vibrating under your feet. The view from the water is striking, the soot-streaked city rising around you, bridges arching overhead, chimneys lined against the skyline. Riverboats were a cheap way to travel, though the smell of coal smoke and sewage often dampened the romance. Historians still argue whether the river was more a blessing or a curse. Its beauty, undeniable. Its stench, unforgettable. The sheer density of movement gave London an energy unlike any other city. Imagine standing at a busy intersection, omnibuses packed with passengers, hansom cabs dashing by, pedestrians weaving between wagons, chimney sweeps darting down alleys, and hawkers shouting wares. The soundscape was deafening, a mix of hoofbeats, bells, shouts, and the occasional swear muttered under breath when a cart splashed muddy water on an unlucky passerby. Transportation also shaped social lives. Working-class families rarely ventured far from their neighborhoods unless they had to. Wealthier Londoners, with access to cabs and carriages, moved more freely, visiting theaters, shops, and friends across the city. When railways linked London with the countryside, the middle class began the new ritual of day trips, fleeing to the seaside or countryside for fresh air. That first taste of escape made city life a little more bearable. Of course, accidents were common. Carriages overturned, trams derailed, horses bolted. Newspapers carried sensational stories of people crushed beneath wheels or trapped under cabs. One quirky report told of a parrot in a hansom cab squawking directions at the driver, confusing everyone on the street. True or not, it captures the chaotic charm of Victorian transport, a mix of danger, comedy, and constant motion. As the century drew to a close, the future hinted at itself. Motor cars, noisy and smelly, appeared on the streets, clashing with horse-drawn vehicles. Some Victorians scoffed, saying the car was a fad. Others saw a revolution coming. Standing on the curb, you feel the rumble of hooves, hear the grind of wheels, and catch the sputter of a motor car. London is caught mid-transition, 1 foot in the past, 1 foot hurtling toward the modern age. And you, standing in the middle of it all, are nearly run down by a hansom cab. You jump back just in time, heart pounding. Consider that your free lesson. Never, ever trust Victorian traffic. You wander away from the chaos of wheels and hooves, slipping down a quieter street, where the smell of stale bread and boiled cabbage drifts from a cellar window. It's here, in the cramped homes and hidden kitchens, that the story of Victorian food unfolds. You might expect roasted meats and puddings like in Dickens's novels, but for most Londoners, dinner was far less romantic and often far less edible. Picture this. You're standing in a dimly lit kitchen, the ceiling stained with soot, the walls damp with condensation. A mother stirs a pot of thin stew, mostly water, potatoes, and maybe a scrap of salted meat, if the family's lucky. For working-class families, food was fuel, not a feast. Bread was the daily staple, so much so that bakers had a reputation for stretching it with chalk, alum, or even ground bones to make it go further. Historians still argue whether Victorian bakers were villains or victims of economic pressure. But one thing's certain. You wouldn't want to bite into that loaf without wondering what mystery ingredient you were chewing. Meanwhile, the upper classes dined like kings. You peek through the window of a grand townhouse in Mayfair, where a lavish dinner party is underway. The table groans with roast pheasant, oysters, and elaborate desserts called jellies that wobble like culinary acrobatics. Silver platters shine, footmen glide silently, and the guests discuss politics between sips of port. For them, meals were not just about food, but status, a stage on which to display wealth and refinement. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorians were obsessed with mock turtle soup, made from calf's head, because real turtle was too expensive. Yes, you're slurping boiled cow brain broth at a fancy party. Try not to gag. Street food, on the other hand, was the lifeline of the poor. Imagine walking down Whitechapel Road and hearing vendors cry out, "Hot eels, baked potatoes, penny pies." You grab a baked potato, steaming in its skin, and bite into its dry, mealy flesh. Cheap, filling, and just warm enough to keep fingers alive on a cold night. Jellied eels, a Cockney classic, were another common fare, eels chopped, boiled, and set in a gelatinous broth. It sounds like something out of a nightmare buffet, but for many, it was protein on a budget. Alcohol was everywhere. Gin had a reputation as the poor man's escape, though by Victorian times, beer and porter were more common. You duck into a tavern, the air thick with smoke and laughter, and order a pint of porter. The drink is dark, foamy, and heavy, sliding down your throat with the taste of roasted barley. Working men clutched mugs after long days, and women, too, drank in pubs despite social disapproval. The gin craze of the previous century still haunted public memory, and reformers wrung their hands over mother's ruin. Historians still argue whether alcohol was the glue holding working-class communities together or the poison tearing them apart. Markets brought chaos and color. You find yourself in Billingsgate, the famous fish market, where the air reeks of salt and scales. Fishmongers shout prices, slapping down slippery eels and heaps of oysters. Oysters, believe it or not, were once dirt cheap and eaten by the poor. Imagine Victorian workers scarfing oysters the way modern folks devour fries. Fast forward a century, and suddenly, oysters are luxury food. History has a funny way of flipping the menu. Sweet tooth? The Victorians had one too. Sugar became cheaper thanks to colonial trade, and suddenly even the poor could afford boiled sweets. Children clutched paper twists of sticky candy, their tongues dyed red or green from chemical dyes that, unfortunately, sometimes contained lead. Yes, lead. You wanted a treat, and instead you got heavy metal poisoning. On the plus side, at least you looked festive while doing it. Meals were deeply tied to class. Breakfast for a wealthy family might be bacon, eggs, and kedgeree, an Anglo-Indian rice dish, while the poor ate stale bread dipped in weak tea. Dinner times varied. Tea could mean a light meal of bread and butter for workers, or an elaborate multi-course affair for the rich. And then there was Sunday dinner, the one day many families scraped together enough for a roast. You can almost smell it now. Beef, dripping fat, potatoes crisping on the edges. For one afternoon the table looked abundant, even if Monday meant returning to watery stew. Food safety was a nightmare. Before modern regulations, milk could be watered down, tea leaves reused and dyed with toxic chemicals, and sweets brightened with copper or arsenic. Newspapers exposed adulterated food scandals, but the practice never fully stopped. Imagine sipping a glass of milk and realizing it's half chalk water. You'd be lucky if your stomach forgave you. For immigrants, food was both survival and culture. Irish immigrants brought potatoes and stews, while Jewish immigrants introduced salt beef and bagels to East London markets. You pause by a stall where bagels are sold hot, chewy, and dense, the smell wafting through the fog. One quirky anecdote: some Victorians mocked bagels as doughy foreign rings, yet today they're a staple of London bakeries. History, again, has the last laugh. Dining also had etiquette. In wealthier homes, meals followed strict rules. Fork in the left, knife in the right, napkin folded just so. Servants moved with precision, while hosts fretted over whether the soup was served at the right temperature. Meanwhile, in the East End, dinner was often eaten standing up, children sharing scraps with bare hands. Both extremes defined the city's dining table, a split screen of excess and scarcity. Food shaped health, too. Malnutrition was rampant among the poor, leading to stunted growth and diseases like rickets. At the same time, the wealthy risked gout from too much rich food. Historians still argue whether Victorian diets shortened lifespans or simply mirrored the brutal realities of urban life. What's certain is this: whether you were feasting in Mayfair or gnawing on a penny pie in Whitechapel, your plate told the story of your place in society. As you leave the tavern, wiping crumbs of stale bread from your coat, you realize food wasn't just sustenance in Victorian London. It was identity, hierarchy, and survival. And as much as you'd like to sit down to a proper roast, you can't help thinking of that jellied eel vendor calling you back. Tempting, isn't it? No? Fair enough. You step out of the smoky tavern, wiping your hands on your coat, and find yourself in a narrower street where the air seems heavier, pressing against your lungs like a damp cloth. London's darkness isn't just the absence of gaslight here. It's a deeper, almost spiritual shadow. This is where whispers of the city's occult underbelly creep in, carried along by the fog, mingling with the sound of boots and carriage wheels. You might think Victorian London was only about factories, workhouses, and smog, but just beneath the surface, people were obsessed with the unseen. Ghosts, seances, spiritualists, fortune tellers, secret societies. Whole networks of shadowy practices flourished while respectable society looked the other way. Imagine following a group of men in stiff collars as they knock on the back door of an unassuming townhouse. Inside, candles flicker, velvet curtains block the street light, and the scent of incense hangs thick in the air. They gather around a table, waiting for the medium to begin. Seances were all the rage in Victorian London. Middle-class families hosted them as a kind of after-dinner entertainment, while serious believers claimed they could reach departed loved ones. Knockings, levitating tables, ghostly voices, all staged in a haze of candlelight. Historians still argue whether most of these mediums were outright frauds, or whether some participants genuinely believed in what they saw. Either way, you're not sure you want to sit too close to the table in case it starts dancing toward you. Fringe tidbit. Some seances featured ectoplasm, that mysterious goo supposedly excreted by mediums, often out of their mouths or even their ears. Investigators later discovered it was usually muslin cloth or chewed paper spit out dramatically. Just imagine, you're sitting in your best suit, watching someone cough up a soggy handkerchief and call it a spirit. Try not to laugh out loud. You don't want to ruin the mood. Occult fascination wasn't confined to parlor tricks. Secret societies like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn attracted intellectuals, poets, and dreamers, all hungry for arcane wisdom. Picture-robed figures chanting in candle-lit halls, diagrams of mystical symbols chalked onto wooden floors, and elaborate rituals promising secret knowledge. Even famous names dabbled. Writers, artists, even aristocrats. For some, it was play acting. For others, a serious attempt to pierce the veil between the seen and unseen. The Victorians also adored ghost stories, and London itself became a living stage for them. Walk down a crooked alley in Whitechapel, and locals might tell you about the spirit of a murdered woman wandering in her nightdress, clutching at passers-by, or head toward Highgate Cemetery, where rumors swirled about apparitions drifting among the tombs. Candlelight vigils, midnight wanderings, and whispered tales gave the city a permanent air of suspense. You can almost hear the echo of boots behind you right now, though of course it's just your imagination. Probably. And then there were the phrenologists and fortune-tellers who set up shop to read skull bumps or predict the future from palms. One eccentric belief held that criminal tendencies could be spotted by measuring head shapes. Historians still argue whether phrenology was pseudoscience or a misguided attempt at early psychology, but it certainly gave Londoners something to talk about. Imagine someone running their fingers over your skull and declaring you destined for thievery. Great confidence booster, right? Dark spiritualism often intersected with darker realities. Grief-stricken families who lost children to disease flocked to mediums, desperate for one last word from the beyond. Fraud or not, these performances gave comfort in a city where death was constant. Some scholars suggest seances were less about spirits and more about giving people a fragile sense of control in a brutal world. Others believe they hinted at a collective hunger for mystery in an age of rapid science and industry. Speaking of science, Victorian London straddled a strange line between faith in reason and obsession with the supernatural. Charles Darwin published his theory of evolution, shaking the foundations of religion, while at the same time thousands crowded parlors to hear ghostly raps and table knocks. The rational and irrational lived side by side like two mismatched tenants forced to share a flat. Even the police weren't immune to superstitions. Some officers carried charms or muttered prayers while patrolling dark alleys. One quirky case involved detectives consulting astrologers to predict the movements of criminals, though whether this ever actually worked remains a matter of debate. Still, you can imagine a stern inspector slipping a horoscope into his pocket before setting off to catch a thief. And then there were the rumors of creatures lurking in the Thames, ghostly carriages seen careening through deserted streets, and tales of people vanishing without a trace. Londoners, already suspicious of the shadows, added layers of supernatural dread to their daily lives. Every strange creak, every wisp of fog, every shadow on the wall could be explained away or amplified by the idea that something otherworldly was watching. For you, walking these streets tonight, the effect is chilling, but oddly soothing. The city's occult fascinations reflect its deepest struggles. The need for meaning, the hunger for hope, the urge to make sense of suffering. Whether in the flicker of a seance candle, the solemn chant of a secret society, or the whispered ghost story told by a child on a stairwell, Victorian London's dark spiritualism gave its people a language to express what ordinary life could not. You pass another doorway where a candle burns low, and you sense, perhaps just for a moment, that if you knocked, you might be invited in to witness something strange, something unexplainable, something that might haunt your dreams. But you walk on, because tonight you've seen enough shadows for one journey. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight, and together we'll drift into our second story. You slip deeper into the city, your footsteps muffled against the damp stones, and for a moment the chatter of markets and the clang of factory bells fade behind you. What replaces them is something more theatrical, a kind of staged reality that Victorians adored as much as they feared, the world of spectacle and sensation. This city, for all its soot and sorrow, also thrived on performance, whether in gaslit theaters, ramshackle penny gaffs, or open-air sideshows where curiosity met commerce. The Victorian era was one of contrasts, and nowhere is that clearer than in its obsession with spectacle. On the one hand, you had Shakespeare revivals at grand theaters like the Drury Lane, resplendent with velvet seats and chandeliers. On the other, you had lurid melodramas and sensational blood and thunder plays in smaller venues that cost a penny to enter. And here's the kicker. Many of these melodramas had plots ripped straight from the newspapers. A murder in Whitechapel? Give it 2 weeks, and you'd see a stage version, complete with fake blood and exaggerated gasps. Historians still argue whether this appetite for reenacting crime on stage dulled public sensitivity or gave people a way to process their anxieties. One quirky detail: gaslighting transformed these theaters into dreamlike caverns. For the first time, audiences could sit in semi-darkness, their attention fixed entirely on the illuminated stage. That sounds normal now, but before gaslight, theaters were lit by candles, and the audience was as visible as the actors. Imagine being able to see everyone fidgeting, flirting, or even throwing orange peels mid-performance. With gaslight, the drama became immersive. Some even claimed the eerie flicker added a supernatural quality, which directors exploited with fog machines and trapdoors for ghostly apparitions. Entertainment wasn't just about the stage, though. Music halls exploded in popularity, offering bawdy songs, comedic sketches, acrobatics and variety acts that drew in the working class. Picture the din of clinking glasses, the haze of cigar smoke, and the roar of laughter as a comedian mimics a pompous politician. These halls became social hubs, places where men and women mingled freely, breaking down some of the stiff barriers of Victorian propriety. And yet, reformers wagged their fingers, warning that music halls corrupted morals with too much drink and too many suggestive songs. Some debates sound eerily familiar, don't they? Kind of like people arguing over TikTok today. Then there were the penny gaffs, small cheap theaters often tucked into basements or back rooms. For a penny, children and laborers could escape into worlds of pirates, cowboys, or gallant knights. The acting was rough, the scenery reused until it sagged, but the thrill was real. Think of it as the Netflix of the Victorian slums. Low budget, a bit questionable, but addictive. One fringe tidbit, some penny gaffs were so cramped and sweaty that reformers declared them health hazards, blaming outbreaks of disease on their foul air. And of course, we can't forget the freak shows. Exhibitors paraded people with unusual bodies. Bearded ladies conjoined twins, giants, and dwarfs, turning human difference into spectacle. Today, the ethics of this are hotly debated. But back then, audiences saw it as curiosity, even education. Barnum himself toured London with General Tom Thumb, who became a celebrity in his own right. Historians still argue whether performers were empowered by earning a living on their own terms or exploited by managers who pocketed most of the profit. Circuses rolled into town with elephants, tightrope walkers, and clowns who teetered between funny and nightmarish. Imagine the gasps as a rider galloped across the ring standing upright on the horse's back. For children who'd never seen a wild animal outside of illustrations, the circus must have felt like stepping into another world. And yet, behind the bright tents lurked the reality of animal mistreatment and grueling schedules for performers. One bizarre tidbit: some circus elephants were paraded through the streets as advertising, leaving souvenirs large enough to halt entire carts in their tracks. The Victorians also loved wax museums. Madame Tussauds became a sensation, with lifelike models of royalty, writers, and criminals. Imagine staring into the glassy eyes of a wax Queen Victoria, then turning a corner to find yourself face to face with wax effigies of executed murderers in the Chamber of Horrors. Visitors thrilled at the closeness to danger without any real risk. It was the true crime podcast of its day, except, with melting wax figures. Spectacle even invaded science. Public lectures, complete with demonstrations of electricity or chemistry, drew eager crowds. Picture a lecturer in a frock coat shocking himself with a Leyden jar or making water appear to burn. Was it education or entertainment? Probably both. Historians still argue whether these scientific spectacles genuinely advanced public knowledge or were just circus tricks dressed in academic clothing. And let's not forget the magic lantern shows, early slide projections that dazzled audiences with images of exotic lands, Bible stories, or ghostly apparitions. Some operators added sound effects and even early attempts at animation, making these shows the ancestors of modern cinema. Imagine a Victorian child gasping as a glowing image of the pyramids appeared on a sheet in a darkened hall. For many, it was the closest they'd come to seeing the wider world. You find yourself smiling faintly as you pass a poster advertising a music hall act, bright colors promising laughter, song, and escape from the soot outside. It's easy to sneer at this hunger for spectacle, but in a city where survival was hard and poverty pressed close, these entertainments gave people something vital: release. They were moments when the heaviness of daily life lifted, even if only for an hour. You keep walking, the distant sound of laughter drifting on the foggy air. It mingles with the clatter of horse hooves and the rattle of carriages, forming a rhythm that feels almost like music itself. In a city so often defined by darkness, spectacle provided a flicker of light, sometimes gaudy, sometimes grotesque, but always irresistible. The fog thickens as you walk, wrapping the gas lamps in hazy halos and making the city seem half real, half dream. You are still in the world of spectacle, but the tone shifts now, away from theaters and circuses and toward something darker: Victorian obsessions with death, the macabre, and the uncanny. Because here's the thing: for all their love of song and laughter, Victorians were equally fascinated with what lay beyond the veil. Death was everywhere in this city. Child mortality rates were staggeringly high. Infectious diseases swept through cramped housing, and workplace accidents cut lives short without warning. Families lived with grief as a constant companion. Instead of pushing death out of sight, Victorians pulled it into their culture, ritualizing it, decorating it, and sometimes even commercializing it. That's where things get strange. Start with mourning customs. When someone died, households followed elaborate rules: black clothing, black drapes on the mirrors, even stopping the household clocks at the moment of death. Queen Victoria herself set the trend after Prince Albert died in 1861, plunging herself into mourning for 40 years. Entire industries sprang up to cater to this obsession. Milliners sold mourning bonnets, printers sold mourning stationery, and photographers offered mourning portraits. It was grief, yes, but grief turned into an economy. One of the strangest practices was post-mortem photography. Families would pose their dead loved ones as if they were still alive, propped in chairs, surrounded by siblings, even standing with the aid of braces. Sometimes the eyes were painted onto closed eyelids in the final photographs. To modern eyes, it seems unsettling, even grotesque. But to Victorians, who often had no other portrait of their loved one, it was a way to hold on to memory. Historians still argue, was it a morbid denial of death or a tender act of remembrance? And then there were the funerals themselves. Elaborate processions with black-plumed horses, velvet-draped carriages, and long trails of mourners were a sign of respectability. The bigger the display, the more it signaled social standing. One fringe tidbit: undertakers sometimes hired professional mourners. Strangers paid to weep loudly and swell the crowd. Imagine crying on command, walking behind a coffin for someone you'd never met. Victorians also flocked to cemeteries, not just for burials, but as public spaces. The magnificent 7 cemeteries built around London in the 19th century, Highgate, Kensal Green, and others, became almost like parks, with winding paths, Gothic tombs, and elaborate sculptures. Families strolled there on Sundays, picnicking among the gravestones. For them, cemeteries weren't only places of sorrow, but landscapes of memory and reflection. Yet mourning wasn't only about ritual. It was also about mystery, spiritualism. The belief that the living could communicate with the dead swept across Britain like wildfire. Seances became fashionable, led by mediums who claimed to summon spirits through raps, table turning, or ghostly voices. In drawing rooms, guests would sit in darkness, hands joined, waiting for a message from beyond. Some seances featured ectoplasm, a gauzy substance supposedly exuded by spirits. Today, we know most of these displays were hoaxes, with cheesecloth hidden in sleeves or luminous paint smeared on props. But at the time, even scientists debated whether something real was happening. One quirky tidbit: the physicist Sir William Crookes, who discovered thallium, attended seances and claimed to have witnessed genuine spiritual manifestations. Meanwhile, skeptics like Harry Houdini later exposed many mediums as frauds. But the longing was real. In an age of high mortality, when families lost children to diphtheria or typhoid, the promise of one last message from a loved one was powerful. Ghost stories thrived too. Authors like Charles Dickens and Sheridan Le Fanu fed a booming market for supernatural tales. Magazines published serialized ghost stories that readers devoured by candlelight. Some ghosts were tragic, others vengeful, but all reflected Victorian anxieties about morality, about science, about the unknown. You can almost picture yourself in a London parlor, the fire crackling low, as someone reads aloud a tale of a pale figure gliding down a moonlit corridor. This fascination with death also took on a scientific edge. The new science of criminology, for example, used the bodies of executed criminals for study. Public dissections were a kind of grim spectacle, part punishment, part education. Phrenology, the belief that the shape of your skull revealed your character, gained popularity, with traveling lecturers feeling bumps on volunteers' heads. Was it science? Not really, but it fit neatly into the Victorian mix of curiosity, control, and the macabre. Then there was the business of death masks, plaster casts made of a person's face after death. Famous writers, politicians, and even criminals had their likenesses preserved this way. Some were displayed in collections for study or morbid fascination. Imagine leaning over a shelf lined with pale, lifeless faces frozen in expression. Were they art? Were they evidence? Historians still argue. Even children's culture absorbed this Gothic atmosphere. Nursery rhymes and fairy tales often carried dark undertones. Ring Around the Rosie, for instance, is often, though controversially, linked to plague imagery. Toy makers sold miniature coffins as playthings, teaching children from a young age that death was part of life. To modern parents, that feels unthinkable. But to Victorians, shielding children from mortality wasn't an option. It was part of daily existence. And yet, amid all this darkness, there was comfort too. Death rituals, however elaborate, gave people a sense of structure. Spiritualism, however dubious, offered hope. Cemeteries, however somber, provided green space in a crowded city. Victorians didn't shy away from death. They folded it into the rhythms of life. You keep walking, and the fog seems to part slightly, revealing the silhouette of an angel statue in a cemetery. Its wings are streaked with soot, its stone face serene. You pause, feeling the weight of history pressing close. For the Victorians, death wasn't an end to be hidden. It was a stage on which grief, memory, and mystery all played their parts. And in that, perhaps, lies a strange kind of comfort. Even in a city obsessed with progress and industry, the Victorians never forgot to make space for the dead. The fog curls tighter, as you leave the cemetery behind, and the city draws you back toward its heart. The bells of St. Paul's toll faintly through the night, echoing across the rooftops, as though reminding you that time itself marches on, no matter how the Victorians tried to hold on to the dead. But London wasn't only obsessed with mourning. Side by side with rituals of grief was another powerful current: invention, technology, and spectacle built on science. This was the age of steam, of gears and pistons, of inventions that reshaped everyday life. You can imagine the hiss of a locomotive pulling into a smoky London station, iron wheels screeching, passengers spilling out with soot-streaked faces and travel trunks. For Victorians, the train was more than a machine. It was a revolution in time and space. Suddenly, journeys that once took days could be done in hours. The countryside collapsed into the city stretched into the countryside. The very idea of distance changed, but alongside this marvel came anxiety. Passengers worried that traveling at high speeds, 30 or 40 miles per hour, might damage the human body. Doctors speculated about railway spine, a mysterious nervous disorder supposedly caused by sudden stops and collisions. There were even debates about whether the human eye could function properly at such velocity. The Victorians stood on the edge of progress, exhilarated but uneasy, half believing the machine might tear them apart. The railway wasn't the only innovation. Telegraph wires spread like a web across Britain, and suddenly messages that once took days by horse could cross the country in minutes. The electric spark that carried these messages seemed almost supernatural, like conjuring voices across the void. Newspapers capitalized on it, printing news from Paris or New York within hours. The world itself shrank, and Victorians were both thrilled and disoriented. And then came light. Gas lamps had already transformed London streets, turning night into something navigable, though still fog-dimmed. But by the mid to late century, experiments with electricity promised even brighter illumination. The arc lamp, blazing white-hot, cast a light that seemed stolen from the sun. People marveled, but some whispered, was this too much? Was mankind tampering with forces meant for nature alone? Science exhibitions became the great theaters of this new world. The Crystal Palace, built in Hyde Park in 1851 for the Great Exhibition, was a vast greenhouse of iron and glass filled with wonders, steam engines, telegraphs, hydraulic presses, even exotic plants and animals shipped from across the empire. Imagine yourself walking those aisles, craning your neck at the towering machines, hearing dozens of languages from visitors who had come from around the world. It was dazzling, a cathedral not of faith, but of progress. Yet, hidden among the marvels were curiosities that blurred the line between science and showmanship. One fringe tidbit: an inventor demonstrated a mechanical leech meant to replace the real thing in bloodletting. Another displayed a perpetual motion machine that never truly worked but drew fascinated crowds. There was even an early attempt at a humanoid robot, clunky gears and brass arms moving stiffly as onlookers gasped. To us, it seems like carnival trickery. To them, it was a glimpse of futures both hopeful and uncanny. Photography, too, transformed life. No longer did families need a portrait painted by hand. They could step into a studio and emerge with a likeness in minutes. But early photography required subjects to sit absolutely still, faces stiff and solemn, because exposures could last many seconds. That's why so many Victorian portraits look stern, not because people lacked joy, but because smiling was too hard to hold. And yet, in that stillness, Victorians felt they had captured something miraculous. Time, frozen, memory, preserved. Science extended even into the body. Physicians experimented with chloroform and ether as anesthetics, allowing surgeries that once meant unbearable agony. There were still dangers, dosages were crude, accidents frequent, but the very idea that pain could be banished felt like magic. At the same time, surgeons began developing antiseptic techniques. Before Joseph Lister introduced carbolic acid sprays, hospitals were breeding grounds of infection. Patients feared surgery more than the illness itself. Imagine the courage of those early medical pioneers, spraying their tools with harsh chemicals, hoping to save lives in an era when even a splinter could turn fatal. And then there was Darwin. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, shaking Victorian faith to its core. The idea that humans were not divinely fixed but part of a long evolutionary chain was scandalous, liberating, and terrifying all at once. Cartoonists lampooned Darwin with ape-like caricatures, while preachers thundered against his ideas. But many also embraced the theory, weaving it into debates about society, class, and empire. For ordinary Londoners, it was both exciting and bewildering to live in an age where the very story of human origins was being rewritten. These scientific upheavals also fueled new fears. The more Victorians pushed into the unknown, the more they worried about the consequences. Stories of scientists meddling too far into forbidden realms began to circulate, feeding directly into the Gothic literature of the age. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, written slightly earlier, found a new audience. Later, Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde would crystallize fears of science, unchaining the darker sides of humanity. In those stories, the laboratory was no longer just a place of discovery. It was a place of dread, and yet the wonder remained stronger. Londoners lined up to see public demonstrations of electricity, sometimes staged like theatrical shows. Audiences gasped as sparks leapt between coils or a glowing bulb lit without flame. One fringe tidbit. Lecturers sometimes passed small shocks through volunteers on stage, making their hair stand on end, both scientific display and comedic trick. Science was not only progress, it was entertainment. As you wander through this world of invention, the fog seems to shimmer with phantom light, as if electricity itself were bleeding into the night air. You realize how dizzying it must have felt to live in this age. One moment, mourning the dead with age-old rituals. The next, marveling at machines that promise to reshape life itself. Victorians walked a line between reverence for the past and breathless anticipation of the future. And you, standing here in their city, can almost feel both currents tugging at your imagination. The night draws you deeper into London, and the gaslight flickers on damp cobblestones. The inventions you've just witnessed, the locomotives, the telegraphs, the glowing lamps, are wonders. But every light casts a shadow. The Victorians were not only inventors and mourners, they were also fearful, suspicious, and endlessly fascinated by the uncanny. It was an age of reason tangled with superstition, science braided with the supernatural. If you follow the fog into certain drawing rooms, you would hear the voices of Londoners murmuring over seances. Imagine velvet curtains drawn, candles guttering, and a circle of men and women holding hands around a polished table. They are respectable people, clergymen, barristers, even members of Parliament, yet they lean forward eagerly, waiting for the tap of a spirit's knock, or the strange tilt of a table that seems to move without human touch. Spiritualism swept through Victorian Britain like wildfire. The idea that the dead could speak to the living through mediums, often women, who found in this role an unexpected authority, was irresistible. After all, this was an age where death was everywhere. Infant mortality remained high. Epidemics swept cities, and wars sent soldiers to graves abroad. The promise that loved ones might be contacted, that grief could be bridged by whispered voices, drew thousands into the seance circle. Mediums produced phenomena that left audiences gasping. Raps on tables, objects levitating, hands of chalky ectoplasm materializing from the dark. Some swore these events were genuine, glimpses into the afterlife. Others suspected trickery, but attended anyway, swept along by the thrill. One fringe tidbit: some mediums employed accomplices hidden in cabinets, releasing spirit hands made of papier-mâché or animal parts, which in dim light seemed eerily real. Yet, even when exposed, people often returned for more. Belief and doubt danced together in the candlelit gloom. The fascination with spiritualism wasn't confined to parlors. Scientists themselves attended seances, desperate to test the limits of the invisible world. Sir William Crookes, a respected chemist and physicist, investigated mediums and declared some genuine. Meanwhile, skeptics like Harry Houdini in later years would dedicate themselves to exposing fraud. But in the Victorian moment, the boundary between serious inquiry and stage illusion was thin, almost porous. Phantasmagoria shows also captured the public's imagination. Traveling entertainers used magic lanterns, early projectors, to cast images of ghosts, skeletons, or demons onto smoke or mist. Audiences shrieked as spectral figures floated toward them, sometimes dissolving into nothingness. It was theater, spectacle, and a reminder that Victorians, for all their scientific ambition, still loved to flirt with terror. Imagine yourself seated in a crowded hall, heart racing as a gigantic ghost face drifts across the haze, children clinging to their mothers, men gripping their canes as though they could swat away the apparition. Ghost stories flourished. Charles Dickens himself wrote chilling tales, not only A Christmas Carol, but dozens of shorter works filled with haunted houses, spectral warnings, and restless spirits. The Victorians believed ghost stories were best told aloud on winter nights, preferably by firelight. In that dim setting, the boundary between imagination and reality grew thin. You can almost hear the rustle of pages and the sharp intake of breath when a sudden knock at the door interrupted the tale. Meanwhile, Gothic architecture itself returned to fashion. Builders raised churches and public buildings in a style meant to echo medieval mystery. Pointed arches, gargoyles, shadowed recesses. Even in the heart of modern London, the old world was being conjured back in stone. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt in this Gothic revival style, looked like something from a storybook, majestic but also faintly ominous, as if lawmakers debated beneath the gaze of ancient specters. The Victorians also explored the supernatural through technology. Photography, that marvel of frozen time, soon became a stage for ghostly illusions. Spirit photography emerged. double exposures or chemical tricks that made faint translucent figures hover beside the living. Widows clutched photographs showing ghostly husbands at their shoulders, convinced the camera had unveiled a hidden truth. One fringe tidbit, a photographer named William Mumler made a fortune selling such portraits, even capturing Mary Todd Lincoln with the ghostly form of her assassinated husband Abraham behind her. To many, it was proof. To skeptics, it was fraud. But again, the allure of contact outweighed the sting of doubt. In the streets, fortune tellers and palm readers set up in shadowed alleys, whispering predictions to nervous customers. Newspapers published horoscopes. Even as telegraphs sped words across oceans, Londoners consulted cards and stars for glimpses into the unknown. Rational progress and irrational hope existed side by side, both shaping daily life. It's easy to dismiss these obsessions as quaint. But imagine the context. A world changing faster than ever, where science upended tradition, where death was constant and the future uncertain. Wouldn't you, too, be tempted to look for signs, to search for order in tea leaves, or to believe that a knock in the night was more than the wind? Even children's toys reflected this fascination with the uncanny. Zoetropes spun pictures into moving figures, seeming almost magical. Automaton dolls blinked and bowed, uncanny in their lifelike gestures. Some children loved them. Others whispered that the toys were watching when no one was near. The Victorians had invented machines that mimicked life, and they weren't quite sure whether to marvel or shudder. In all these moments, seances, phantasmagoria, spirit photographs, you feel the tension of the Victorian spirit, the yearning for knowledge, the fear of being deceived, the desire to glimpse beyond the veil. It was an age of belief and disbelief, of ghosts conjured both by candlelight and by chemistry. As you step from the seance circle back into the foggy street, the night itself seems charged with hidden presences. Every flicker of gaslight feels like a spirit's wink. Every shifting shadow could be a ghost. You realize that for Victorians, the supernatural wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into it, a constant companion in an era that wanted both proof and mystery. And in the drifting London mist, you can almost sense why. The fog of London curls around your ankles as you walk, and from a distance you hear the swell of voices rising not in a seance this time, but in the booming theaters that line the Strand. For Victorians, entertainment was a lifeline, a way to laugh, to marvel, to feel awe in a world of hardship and uncertainty. If science offered knowledge and spiritualism promised mystery, then the stage delivered both illusion and release. Step inside Drury Lane or Covent Garden, and you find yourself surrounded by chandeliers, red velvet curtains, and the eager chatter of hundreds of people pressed shoulder to shoulder. The air smells faintly of gas lamps, sweat, and oranges sold by vendors. Here, performers create whole worlds in a single night. Melodrama is the reigning king. Tales of noble heroes, scheming villains, long-lost children, and miraculous reunions. Every gesture is exaggerated, every emotion larger than life, so that even the poor man in the back row can follow. When the villain sneers, the crowd hisses. When the heroine weeps, handkerchiefs flutter in sympathy. But theater wasn't only for adults. Pantomime became a Christmas tradition. Wild, colorful shows filled with slapstick, acrobatics, and whimsical transformations. Imagine children squealing as a pumpkin turns into a glittering carriage, or as a clown tumbles headfirst into a barrel. Pantomimes blended fairy tale magic with biting satire, slipping jokes about politicians into scenes of flying fairies and talking animals. It was a place where the rigid hierarchy of Victorian society melted into shared laughter. And then came the music halls, raucous, smoky, buzzing with energy. Unlike the respectable theaters, these were for everyone: laborers, sailors, clerks, and their families. Tables crowded with beer mugs surrounded the stage, and performers belted out comic songs, cheeky ballads, or sentimental tunes about lost loves and distant homes. The audience sang along, stamping feet and clapping hands. A famous song might echo through the streets the next morning, hummed by children on their way to school. One fringe tidbit: women in the music hall often became the stars of the show, wielding a kind of independence rare in other parts of society. Singers like Marie Lloyd drew huge crowds with witty, suggestive songs, using humor and charm to poke fun at the seriousness of Victorian manners. Though criticized by moralists, these performers carved out space where laughter and boldness reigned. But not all Victorian entertainment was confined to stages. The public loved spectacles, strange exhibitions that blended education with shock. At the Crystal Palace, rebuilt after the Great Exhibition, visitors gaped at models of dinosaurs, enormous glass cases filled with tropical plants, and displays of exotic animals. Traveling circuses rolled through towns, bringing acrobats, fire-eaters, and elephants that lumbered down narrow streets. Crowds swarmed for curiosities like the Fiji mermaid, a grotesque hybrid sewn from monkey and fish parts that left audiences both repelled and enthralled. The Victorians also adored optical wonders. Magic lantern shows, similar to the ghostly phantasmagoria but often educational, projected vivid slides of faraway lands, scientific diagrams, or biblical scenes. A family might gather in a darkened parlor while colored images danced across a wall, accompanied by dramatic narration. To children, it was as thrilling as cinema would be decades later. And there was sport: rowing on the Thames, cricket on the village greens, boxing matches in dim back rooms. Football, too, began to formalize in this era, evolving from chaotic scrums into organized clubs with written rules. Imagine a mud field, men charging after a leather ball while crowds cheered from the sidelines, unaware that they were witnessing the birth of a global pastime. For the upper classes, leisure took other forms. They attended grand balls where ladies in silk gowns twirled beneath crystal chandeliers, or they journeyed to the countryside for fox hunts and horse races. At Ascot, top hats and parasols bobbed as thoroughbreds thundered past, and fortunes were won or lost on a single race. Leisure was not just about pleasure, it was a way to display status, to prove one's place in society. Even reading became a form of entertainment reshaped by the Victorians. Cheaply printed penny dreadfuls sold for a penny each, thrilling young readers with lurid tales of highwaymen, vampires, or infamous murderers. One such figure, Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, emerged from these publications, his legend spreading through dimly lit print shops long before it reached modern musicals. At the other end of the spectrum, serialized novels kept entire households waiting for the next chapter of Dickens or Wilkie Collins, gathering by the fire to hear each installment read aloud. A curious detail: the Victorians often blurred the line between entertainment and instruction. Museums were not dusty halls for scholars only. They became popular attractions. The British Museum, filled with Egyptian mummies and ancient artifacts, drew curious families eager to marvel at wonders of the past. To walk its galleries was to travel through time, an adventure as thrilling as any stage play. In all these entertainments, whether high art or cheap amusement, you sense the hunger of a people living in an uncertain age. Industry, science, and empire reshaped their world so quickly that they craved both escape and wonder. A night at the theater, an afternoon at the circus, even a penny dreadful read in bed, all offered a kind of release, a reminder that life was more than work and worry. Now, as you step from the noise of the music hall back into the foggy street, you realize that entertainment was not a luxury for the Victorians. It was a necessity. Laughter, fear, awe, and song were threads that held together communities, soothed grief, and gave meaning to long gray days. For in the end, even in an empire of factories and machines, the human heart still needed stories. And in London, the stories never stopped. The night grows colder as you leave the echo of laughter behind, and your footsteps carry you toward another form of gathering. This time, not for merriment, but for debate, instruction, and reform. If the Victorians loved their theaters and music halls, they equally adored the lecture halls, public forums, and radical meeting spaces where words held the power to reshape lives. Imagine stepping into Exeter Hall, one of London's great venues for speeches and rallies. The air is electric, the wooden benches filled with men and women eager to hear arguments that might alter the course of the nation. Reformers raise their voices about abolition, about temperance, about education for the poor. The Victorians, for all their contradictions, were tireless talkers. They believed in the power of words to stir conscience, to challenge injustice, to push society forward. In smaller corners of the city, the meetings are even more radical. Enter a cramped pub back room in Soho, where trade unionists gather. Smoke thickens the air as men debate wages, working hours, and the right to organize. They know that one day's strike might mean hunger for their families, yet they dream of a future where their children will not climb chimneys or crawl beneath whirring machines. Their voices, though soft compared to Parliament's thunder, will lay the foundation for labor rights in the century ahead. Then there were the reformers who carried their arguments to the streets. Think of the suffragists, women in plain yet determined dress, handing out pamphlets beneath the watchful eyes of skeptical policemen. While full suffrage for women was decades away, their persistence planted seeds of change. Their gatherings, whether in drawing rooms or on public corners, reminded Victorians that progress often began with a small circle of the stubborn and the brave. Education, too, was a battleground. Many Victorians believed knowledge was the surest path out of poverty, and so philanthropic groups established Sunday schools, mechanics institutes, and public lectures on everything from geology to literature. Imagine yourself among working men who, after a long day in the factory, sit with weary eyes but eager ears to hear a lecture on astronomy. The lecturer points to diagrams of planets, and for a moment, the audience feels lifted from smoky streets into the vastness of the cosmos. But not all gatherings carried noble causes. Some meetings were driven by fear, prejudice, or self-interest. In certain circles, debates about empire framed conquest and colonization as duty rather than exploitation. Pamphlets warned of foreign threats, fueling nationalism and suspicion. The same culture that produced reformers also produced reactionaries who clung to hierarchy and resisted change. A fringe tidbit, debates often spilled into unexpected venues. Even in music halls, between comic songs, a fiery speaker might rise to deliver a political diatribe. Audiences booed or cheered, beer sloshing from mugs, as words of reform or resistance filled the smoky air. Politics, in Victorian London, was not confined to Westminster. It was a living, breathing thing, argued in every corner where people gathered. At Hyde Park, the tradition of free speech took a literal form. The park's Speaker's Corner became a place where anyone, poet, preacher, or eccentric, could mount a soapbox and proclaim their vision. Picture a Sunday afternoon, crowds gathering, some laughing at the wild gestures of a self-proclaimed prophet, others nodding seriously to a socialist's call for justice. Children weave through the crowd, tugging at their mothers' skirts, while policemen watch cautiously from a distance. It was chaotic, messy, and profoundly democratic in spirit. Yet, even as these public voices rang out, private salons played their role. In the parlors of Bloomsbury or Kensington, intellectuals gathered to read papers aloud, debate art, or argue over Darwin's latest ideas. Teacups clinked as discussions grew heated and friendships sometimes fractured under the weight of new philosophies. These gatherings, though quieter than rallies, were equally powerful. They shaped literature, criticism, and science in ways that rippled far beyond the drawing room. And then there were the societies, specialized clubs devoted to every imaginable pursuit. The Geological Society, the Royal Institution, the Linnean Society, all brought together thinkers who presented papers, debated discoveries, and sometimes ridiculed one another with merciless wit. Even ordinary citizens formed societies, chess clubs, literary circles, debating groups. In an age before radio or cinema, such assemblies were the lifeblood of intellectual and social life. But beneath all this energy lurked anxiety. The Victorians feared that too much talk might destabilize the fragile order of society. Authorities kept close watch on radical meetings. Newspapers reported anxiously about protests and strikes. Words could inspire, but they could also incite. The same passion that fueled reform might, in the eyes of officials, fuel revolution. After all, only decades earlier, across the Channel, France had shown how swiftly talk of liberty could turn into barricades and bloodshed. Still, the gatherings continued, because to the Victorians, speech was power. Even the poorest chimney sweep might, in a heated pub debate, feel for a moment that his voice mattered. Even the most silenced women might, in a circle of like-minded friends, taste the possibility of change. And so you find yourself lingering at the edge of these assemblies, listening as voices rise and fall. Some are lofty and eloquent, others rough and stumbling, but all carry the pulse of an age that was trying to define itself. The Victorians were not content merely to endure. They argued, they dreamed, they protested, they sang. As night deepens, you step away from the crowded hall, the echo of speeches still in your ears. You realize that in a city of constant transformation, conversation itself was a kind of survival. To speak, to gather, to share ideas was to insist that even amid fog, poverty, and fear, the human spirit had not gone silent. Words were weapons, comforts, and beacons in the dark. As you drift farther into the city's labyrinth, the glow of gathering halls fades, and another form of collective life reveals itself, not in speech or protest, but in ritual, devotion, and faith. For Victorians, religion was not merely a Sunday obligation. It was the rhythm of existence, the constant pulse beneath their daily struggles and aspirations. Step inside a towering Anglican church on a frosty morning. The stone arches soar above you, and your breath fogs in the chill air as the organ swells. Rows of parishioners in stiff collars and bonnets kneel, murmuring prayers that blend into a low hum of reverence. The sermon is long, filled with exhortations about morality, family duty, and charity. Some listen intently, others drift into weary half-sleep, but all recognize this weekly gathering as the anchor of community life. Yet London's spiritual life was not confined to its grand churches. Down narrow streets, nonconformist chapels offered a different flavor of worship. Fiery, impassioned, sometimes ecstatic. Picture a preacher pounding his fist upon the pulpit, sweat glistening on his brow as he speaks of sin and salvation. The congregation responds with fervent amens, their voices rising like a storm. For those weary of the rigid Anglican establishment, these chapels offered warmth, passion, and a sense of belonging. Then there were the Catholic churches, many filled with Irish immigrants who carried their faith across the sea. Candles flickered before statues of saints, incense curled in the air, and hymns in unfamiliar accents echoed against the walls. To many native Londoners, Catholicism seemed foreign, even threatening. But for the immigrant poor, it was solace, identity, and strength. Beyond the Christian denominations, the city quietly held other faiths too. Jewish communities gathered in synagogues tucked into East End streets, their prayers murmured in Hebrew, their traditions carefully preserved amid poverty and prejudice. The call of faith kept their culture alive even in the face of hardship. And then there were the spiritual fringe movements, thriving in a society both deeply religious and deeply curious about the unseen. The Victorians loved seances, ghost stories, and table rapping. Imagine a dimly lit parlor where candles flicker as participants join hands around a table. A medium closes her eyes, breathing heavily, before a faint knock echoes from the wooden surface. Gasps ripple through the room. Is it the spirit of a lost loved one, or merely trickery? For many, such evenings offered comfort in grief, a way to bridge the growing gap between religion and science. This fascination with the beyond was not confined to private salons. Spiritualist societies sprang up, publishing journals and holding lectures on the existence of an afterlife. Some Victorians saw these practices as dangerous frauds preying on grief. Others embraced them as proof that faith and modernity could coexist in strange experimental forms. A curious tidbit. Even Queen Victoria herself attended seances after the death of Prince Albert. In her mourning, she turned to mediums in hope of a message from her beloved. Her example lent legitimacy to a movement otherwise ridiculed by the intellectual elite. But religion was not only about ritual and consolation, it was also about social order. The church often reinforced Victorian morality, sobriety, chastity, obedience. Sermons condemned the music hall and the gin shop, urging the poor to find strength in faith rather than in rebellion. In this way, religion served both as comfort and as control, reminding believers that their reward might come not in this life, but in the next. Still, faith inspired charity as well. Many reform movements sprang from religious conviction, the drive for education, for abolition, for care of the poor. Mission halls dotted the East End, offering soup, blankets, and Bibles. Imagine children with hollow cheeks lining up for bread, clutching tin cups as hymns were sung, their bellies filled, their spirits lifted, if only for a night. There were also darker sides to religious life. Hellfire preaching terrified children into obedience. The strict codes of behavior left many suffocated, especially women, who bore the burden of piety for their households. And religious division sometimes fueled hostility rather than compassion. Protestants railing against Catholics, skeptics mocking believers, each convinced of their righteousness. Yet, for all its contradictions, religion in Victorian London was everywhere. In the toll of church bells, in the tracts handed out on street corners, in the whispered prayers of a mother putting her child to bed. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, as common as fog and as constant as hunger, and in its shadows grew doubt. As science advanced, Darwin's theories, geological discoveries, the rise of secular philosophy, many Victorians found their faith shaken. Some reconciled belief with knowledge, seeing divine order in evolution. Others turned away entirely, embracing agnosticism or atheism. In their debates, one hears the struggle of an age caught between tradition and modernity, between certainty and curiosity. You pause at the doorway of a quiet chapel, the candles flickering low. Outside, the city still roars with noise and unrest, but here the air is hushed. For a moment, you sense why faith mattered so much to Victorians. It was not only about salvation or dogma. It was about endurance. To believe, even in the midst of disease, poverty, or grief, was to keep a spark alive against the darkness. And as you step back into the night, you carry with you the realization that religion, whether embraced or questioned, was one of the great forces shaping the Victorian soul. It was the breath behind their hymns, the fuel behind their reforms, and the weight behind their fears. In their devotion, their doubt, and their endless searching, you see not relics of the past, but mirrors of struggles that endure still. The night stretches on, and you find yourself wandering into the hidden corners where culture itself is forged. Not the churches or factories, but the ink-stained rooms and smoky taverns where writers, poets, and artists of Victorian London tested the boundaries of imagination. You're stepping not just into the shadows of the city, but into the shadows of its stories. Imagine a cramped room above a bookshop in Bloomsbury. The wallpaper peels, the candles burn low, and a group of young writers argue over the latest serialized novel. One insists that Charles Dickens is the voice of the people. Another sneers, claiming he's far too sentimental. A third sips weak tea and whispers that they too have a manuscript nearly ready for a publisher, though it's more likely to end up shoved in a drawer. Literature in Victorian London wasn't just a pastime, it was a revolution. The penny dreadfuls, sold for a single coin, brought lurid tales of crime, monsters, and mystery to the masses. Imagine a grubby-handed child clutching one beneath a lamppost, reading about Sweeney Todd or Varney the Vampire. Historians still argue whether such cheap literature corrupted young minds or empowered them with stories that mirrored their fears. Either way, those thin pamphlets kept imaginations blazing in even the poorest households. Meanwhile, serialized novels transformed publishing forever. Each month, readers awaited the next installment of Dickens's Bleak House or Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White. You can almost hear the excitement in the crowded streets. Did you read the latest? What do you think happens next? Cliffhangers weren't invented by Netflix, you know. They were a Victorian specialty, and Londoners devoured them. Art, too, pushed at the boundaries of the respectable. Step into a gallery, and you might find the works of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood with their lush colors, medieval themes, and languid figures gazing dreamily into eternity. Some critics declared them geniuses, resurrecting a lost beauty. Others muttered that they were scandalous, even indecent. One reviewer quipped that their women looked as though they had consumed too much laudanum, which, to be fair, was a common enough Victorian pastime. Beyond galleries, music halls roared with laughter, song, and satire. Picture yourself squeezed into a smoky hall, the floor sticky with spilled beer, as a comic sings a bawdy tune to uproarious applause. The upper classes tutted at such vulgar entertainment, yet many secretly attended, hiding behind their top hats. In those rowdy spaces, ordinary Londoners found joy, release, and perhaps a touch too much gin. But culture wasn't always so cheerful. Some art exposed the raw pain of the age. Gothic fiction thrived, spinning tales of haunted houses, doppelgangers, and sinister fog. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde captured the duality of a city itself, respectable by day, monstrous by night. Historians still debate whether this novel was really about morality, about addiction, or about London itself wearing a mask. Even the city's architecture carried a cultural message. The new Gothic revival buildings, with their spires and gargoyles, weren't just decoration. They were attempts to anchor modern life in medieval grandeur, to suggest permanence in a world that felt dangerously unstable. You walk past the Houses of Parliament, their towers lit against the night, and you sense how architecture itself became a narrative, reassuring, intimidating, and deeply symbolic. There was also satire, sharp enough to cut through any pretense. Magazines like Punch mocked politicians, bishops, and society ladies alike, with cartoons that Londoners devoured over breakfast. Imagine giggling over a caricature of a pompous lord while buttering a slice of toast. It made hypocrisy feel a little less suffocating, and tucked in quieter corners, there were voices rarely heard. Women writing under male pseudonyms, like the Bronte sisters or George Eliot, smuggling their perspectives into a male-dominated literary world. Imagine a woman in candlelight, quill scratching furiously, knowing that her story might only be accepted if hidden behind a man's name. Culture was not only art, but rebellion, quiet and persistent. Fringe art had its moment too. Spiritualist artists claimed to draw visions from the beyond, their canvases filled with strange, swirling shapes. Others experimented with photography, ghost photographs to be exact. These double exposures showed faint figures hovering behind living subjects, and while skeptics laughed, many Victorians treasured them as proof of eternal bonds. A quirky fact: some families posed with supposed spirits of their dead children, proudly displaying the prints in their parlors. And don't forget the theater. From Shakespearean revivals to melodramatic crime plays, London's stages offered endless spectacle. Gaslight illuminated elaborate sets, and actors thundered their lines to packed houses. Sometimes the audience was more entertaining than the performance, shouting, booing, or even throwing vegetables. Your modern cinema seems tame by comparison. Through all this, culture served as both escape and mirror. The poor could imagine other worlds in cheap stories. The middle classes could debate morality through novels. The wealthy could indulge in paintings and performances that reassured or unsettled them. And woven into all of it was London itself, its fog, its crime, its contradictions, emerging not just as backdrop, but as a character. As you step back from the music halls, galleries, and bookstalls, you realize Victorian London's culture was not a polite museum piece. It was noisy, contradictory, and alive. It was the laughter of a packed theater, the hush of a chapel-turned-gallery, the gasp at a shocking plot twist in the latest serialized novel. It was art made not for eternity, but for the moment. And in that moment, it helped Londoners survive their own darkness. And perhaps, as you think of your own world of streaming shows, viral memes, and paperback thrillers, you see that culture is always both a mirror and a mask, a way to laugh, cry, and make sense of the city's shadows. The hour grows late, but your wandering mind refuses to rest. You slip now into the shadowed corridors of science and discovery, those relentless engines that powered Victorian London forward while unsettling everyone who tried to keep their footing. It is here, in laboratories thick with the scent of chemicals and lecture halls echoing with heated debates, that you see how knowledge became both salvation and terror. Start with medicine. Walk into a London hospital of the 1840s, and your senses are assaulted immediately. The sharp metallic tang of blood, the sour odor of unwashed bodies, and the echo of saws gnawing through bone. Surgery was often performed without anesthesia until the 1846 demonstration of ether, followed soon after by chloroform. Imagine lying on a crude operating table, terrified, and then drifting into blissful unconsciousness. Though not always safely. Chloroform could kill as easily as it soothed, yet Queen Victoria herself famously used it during childbirth, lending it royal approval. Progress in Victorian London was never without risk. Public health, too, was revolutionized in both triumph and tragedy. Picture yourself walking down Broad Street in 1854, where cholera raged through the neighborhood. Most people believed it spread through miasma, foul air rising from filth. But here comes Dr. John Snow, calm and methodical, mapping cases house by house until he identifies the true culprit, a contaminated water pump. You can almost see him removing the handle, cutting off the epidemic at its source. One act of logic against the tide of superstition, proof that science could outwit death. And yet, superstition clung fiercely. Quack doctors peddled patent medicines, bottles of colored liquid promising cures for every ailment, usually laced with opium, mercury, or alcohol. Imagine a weary mother giving her teething child soothing syrup, never realizing she was poisoning them. Advertisements shouted of miraculous results, and the public, desperate for hope, bought them eagerly. Science advanced, but snake oil never quite disappeared. Meanwhile, great laboratories hummed with experiments. Michael Faraday, in his cluttered workshop at the Royal Institution, spun coils of wire and magnets, laying the groundwork for electricity that would one day illuminate entire cities. You stand in the crowd as he demonstrates, sparks dancing at his fingertips, Victorian gentlemen and ladies gasping as if witnessing sorcery. The age of steam was giving way to the age of current, and London buzzed with the thrill of possibility. Astronomy, too, captured imaginations. Telescopes probed distant planets, and heated debates raged over whether Mars harbored canals and thus intelligent life. Ordinary Londoners, peering through cheap telescopes on foggy nights, whispered about extraterrestrial neighbors. The universe itself felt suddenly alive with company, though no one could agree on what kind. And then came Darwin. In 1859, his On the Origin of Species shocked polite society. Picture the gasps in drawing rooms as the idea spread. Humanity descended from apes, not fashioned in perfect form. Priests thundered from pulpits. Caricatures mocked Darwin as a bearded monkey, yet the idea took root. You imagine yourself in a lecture hall, the air tense, as students argue whether science had just toppled the very pillars of faith. Victorian London was never the same after Darwin whispered evolution into its ear. Not all discoveries were so cosmic. Some were deeply practical, like the sewers engineered by Joseph Bazalgette after the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames reeked so badly that Parliament itself nearly suffocated. Picture the river clogged with waste, the hot summer amplifying the stench until lawmakers finally acted. Bazalgette's immense underground system not only saved London from a cholera, but also reshaped the city's very foundations. Science here wasn't just theory, it was survival. Even crime and science collided. The police, increasingly turning to forensics, dabbled in fingerprinting and chemical tests. The first mugshots were taken. The first attempts at criminal profiling whispered that science might illuminate even the darkest human behavior. You picture a detective in a cramped office, peering at a bloodstain beneath lamplight, muttering that one day such traces might tell the whole story. Yet, with every advance came fear. Electricity terrified as much as it dazzled. Would it set houses aflame? Would invisible currents invade the body? The telegraph shrank distances so suddenly that many muttered it was unnatural, even dangerous to sanity. New machines displaced workers, sparking riots against the faceless march of progress. To live in Victorian London was to stand on shifting ground, where each breakthrough promised wonders and whispered threats. And, of course, there was the fringe, seances masqueraded as science, complete with ectoplasm and spirit photographs. Phrenology claimed to read character from skull bumps, while mesmerists promised to heal through invisible magnetic forces. Learned men, some respected, others ridiculed, blurred the line between experiment and spectacle. You can almost hear the audience debating afterward, was it real or just a clever trick? In a city hungry for wonder, few cared which it was. The laboratories, lecture halls, and pamphlets of London formed a strange symphony, reason battling superstition, invention colliding with fear. Through it all, the city throbbed with curiosity, restless and insatiable. Even as gas lamps flickered in the fog, Londoners dreamed of electric light, of flying machines, of cures for every ill. And so, as you step back from the dissecting rooms, the pumping stations, the smoky lecture halls, you realize science in Victorian London was not a clean march of progress. It was messy, perilous, often absurd, but it reshaped the city into something recognizably modern. For every quack tonic, there was a microscope. For every superstition, a new theory. For every fog of ignorance, a spark of truth. You breathe in the heavy night air tinged with coal smoke and river damp, and it feels as though discovery itself hums beneath the cobblestones. The city is alive, not only with people, but with ideas, bold, reckless, and unstoppable. And you, wandering among them, feel the tremor of a world learning to ask questions it could barely imagine. You move slowly now, feet dragging as though the city itself has weighed you down with all its countless stories. Victorian London, for all its grime and shadow, still holds you close, like a strange companion who has poured out secrets deep into the night and now waits for you to remember them. The air is damp, heavy with the tang of soot and river mist, and every flickering gaslight feels like a candle guttering before dawn. The hour has grown late, and yet somehow you can still sense the pulse of life running beneath these darkened streets. You glance at the narrow alleyways half swallowed by fog. In the day they teemed with hawkers and children darting underfoot, but now they seem almost suspended in time, waiting for morning to return. Imagine walking past a workhouse door, bolted tight, where the destitute sleep under coarse blankets, their dreams shaped by hunger and exhaustion. Further along, behind iron gates, grand mansions stand silent, their curtains drawn, their chandeliers dark. The contrast is jarring, one world stacked upon another, and yet it was always like this, a city of sharp divides. Historians still argue whether this divide was ever truly bridgeable, or whether the Victorians simply learned to live in permanent tension. As you drift past St. Paul's Dome, its great shadow looming over the city, you recall how it survived the Blitz decades later. The Victorians themselves could never have imagined the world wars to come, but in their minds, London was already eternal. They built with an almost stubborn faith in progress, bridges that stretched further, tunnels that cut deeper, towers that stabbed higher. And still, the fog crept in, softening the edges, reminding them that nothing man-made could ever truly master the city's soul. You step onto the embankment, and the Thames greets you with its dark shimmer. The river has been your companion from the beginning, carrying coal, bodies, messages, refuse, and dreams alike. Scientists tested its tides, poets sang its verses, criminals used its depths to hide evidence. And you, standing here, can almost hear all those voices layered like echoes, a lighterman shouting, a barmaid humming, a reformer addressing a restless crowd. Quirky rumor has it, some Victorians believed the Thames itself could spread cholera simply by releasing its foul-smelling vapors. They weren't entirely wrong about the danger, though they couldn't yet see the microscopic culprit. Your mind drifts to the people you've met along the way, the chimney sweep coughing through his soot, the factory girl with blistered hands, the eccentric gentleman who swore seances were the future of science, the pickpocket vanishing into the crowd. They all feel present now, clustered around you in this foggy night, as if the city wants you to carry them with you when you go. They lived small, brief lives in a city that often chewed people up and spat them out, but their voices stitched together the fabric of an age. Without them, there would be no history, only architecture and names carved into stone. And then you think of the contradictions, how the Victorians gave the world both dazzling railways and suffocating smog, both glittering museums and child labor, both Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper. No wonder the ages feels mysterious even today. Historians still argue whether it was the beginning of the modern world or merely a darker echo of older patterns dressed in soot-black clothes. You walk on, and the city itself seems to settle. The noise of factories quiets, the carriages vanish, the market cries dissolve. Only the occasional clop of a horse or a faint whistle on the river cuts through the hush. For the first time, London feels still, almost gentle. The fog thickens, wrapping you like a blanket. Your breathing slows. Somewhere behind you, Big Ben tolls midnight, its deep chimes rolling through the mist like a lullaby meant only for you. And here, in this softened silence, you finally understand. The mystery of Victorian London was never just about crime or poverty or progress. It was about how people managed to live between extremes, how they clung to hope, even in alleys that smelled of rot, how they laughed and loved and schemed beneath a sky always half hidden by smoke. That tension, the dance between shadow and light, was the heartbeat of the age. And though the world has moved on, the echo of that heartbeat lingers if you pause long enough to hear it. Your eyelids feel heavy now. The city fades at the edges, its cobblestones dissolving into mist. You know you could summon it again whenever you like, return to its gaslit streets, its clamoring voices. But for tonight, you let it drift away, slow and quiet, until it becomes only a whisper. London sleeps, and so will you. So, the journey ends here. You've walked through 25 long sections of foggy alleys, factory smoke, gilded ballrooms, and river whispers, and now the story finally folds itself shut. The city of Victorian London has been loud, crowded, and sometimes a little unsettling. But tonight, in the calm of your own space, it all recedes into something softer. You feel the echoes of its voices fading, not in fear, but in peace. The workhouse doors close gently. The theaters dim their chandeliers. The clatter of hooves becomes a distant murmur. The fog that once smothered the streets now wraps around you like a protective quilt, and every lamp that flickered in the mist becomes a small, steady star, guiding you toward rest. Breathe in slowly, as though drawing in the cool river air, and breathe out as the city exhales with you. Each sound grows fainter, each shadow grows lighter, and the heavy rhythm of the Thames becomes your own heartbeat, calm and steady, carrying you to stillness. You've seen the mysteries, the contradictions, the lives both ordinary and extraordinary, and you've held them long enough. Now it's time to let them go, to let London drift back into history where it belongs. Close your eyes. Let the fog thin. Let the streets vanish. Let only the quiet remain. You are safe. You are still. You are resting. And as you slip further into sleep, the city will keep its secrets until you return again.